There are stories that time seeks to bury, tales so dark that the very land upon which they transpired seems to reject their memory. They linger not in history books, but in the quiet spaces between grandmother's warnings and in the uneasy silence that falls upon certain woods after sunset. This is one such story, a chronicle from the early years of our republic, a black stain upon the soil of Virginia. It is the tale of Mercy Hollow, a settlement that vanished not in a whisper, but in a scream of fire and fanaticism. I tell it to you not as a fanciful legend, but as a truth passed down through a line shadowed by its touch, a warning of how swiftly devotion can curdle into damnation, and how the purest faith can become the instrument of the most profound evil. Listen, then, to what became of that peaceful hollow, and of the daughter who was chosen to light the pyre. The summer of 1802 in the Allegheny foothills was a season of profound and almost arrogant bounty. The sun, a benevolent gold coin fixed in an azure sky, lavished its attention upon the secluded valley known as Mercy Hollow. The settlement itself was a testament to stubborn perseverance, a cluster of some 30-odd log cabins and clapboard houses nestled along the banks of the slow-moving Willow Creek. The air thrummed with the industrious sounds of a community at peace with its labors, the rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting cordwood for the coming winter, the distant lowing of cattle in the high pasture, the cheerful shrieks of children chasing fireflies in the long twilight. The scent of rich, dark earth, of sun-warmed pine, and of baking bread from a dozen hearths hung perpetually in the air, a perfume of contentment. The most prosperous farm, a neat parcel of 100 acres at the valley's head, belonged to Jacob Miller. Jacob was a man of solid German stock, his frame broad and strong from a life of toil, his face tanned and creased like well-worn leather. He was a man of few words but deep feeling, his piety expressed not in loud proclamations but in the careful stewardship of his land and the unwavering provision for his family. His wife, Abigail, was the heart of their home, a woman whose gentle spirit seemed to emanate from her like the fragrance from her prized English rose bushes, which flourished improbably beside their cabin door. Her hands, though worn from churning and sewing, were always gentle, her voice a soft melody that could soothe a frightened child or a skittish horse with equal ease. Their family was their pride. There was young Samuel, a boy of 8 with straw-colored hair and a propensity for bringing home tadpoles in his pockets, and little Ruth, a cherubic girl of 5 whose laughter was like the tinkling of a crystal bell. But it is upon the eldest that our story must most firmly fix its gaze. Their firstborn, a girl of 17 years, was named for her mother, Abigail. Yet, to most in the hollow, she was known simply as Sister Abigail. From her earliest youth, the elder Abigail had exhibited a temperament of unusual sensitivity and devoutness. While other girls her age dreamed of husbands and homesteads, she would spend hours in the small, whitewashed chapel at the edge of the settlement, captivated by the way the stained-glass window cast jeweled light upon the rough-hewn pews. She found God not only in Scripture but in the severe beauty of a winter frost and the silent fall of night. It was a piety that her parents, God-fearing as they were, found both bewildering and awe-inspiring. When she turned 16, her calling could no longer be contained within the secular world. With their bittersweet blessing, she had taken the veil as a novice at the cloister of St. Jude, a stark, stone-built convent perched on the wooded ridge overlooking the very valley of her birth. On this particular Sunday, Sister Abigail was visiting her family, a monthly allowance granted by the Reverend Mother. She sat with them on a rough-hewn bench beneath a great oak tree, her posture unnaturally straight, her hands folded in the lap of her simple gray serge habit. The coarse woolen fabric was a stark contrast to the printed calico dresses of the other village women. Her once rosy complexion had paled to the hue of parchment, and her eyes, which had once sparkled with a girl's mischief, now held a deep, almost unsettling stillness. She partook of her mother's honey cakes and listened to her father's news of the harvest, but her responses were polite, distant, as if she were a traveler merely passing through a pleasant but transient land. She was a creature of two worlds, and it was already clear to any who looked closely which one was claiming more of her soul. The bountiful summer held its breath, unaware that a canker was growing at its very heart, nurtured not in the sun, but in the cold, shadowed stone of the cloister on the ridge. The cloister of St. Jude was not a place that invited the eye. It squatted on its wooded promontory like a great, gray beast, its back turned against the comforts of the valley below. Built decades prior by a order that favored severity over splendor, its architecture was one of pure function and grim endurance. The walls were of local granite, rough-hewn and thick, pierced by narrow, lancet windows that seemed less designed to admit light than to repel assault. A single, square bell tower, topped with a plain iron cross, stood sentinel over the complex, its bell silent save for the calls to prayer. There were no decorative flourishes, no gardens of note, only a small, walled herb plot where the sisters grew the practical plants for their kitchen and infirmary. The air around the cloister was perpetually cooler, the sunlight thinner, as if the very stones leached the warmth from the world. Life within those walls was a meticulously ordered echo, a ritualized existence designed to silence the individual will in service of the divine. The day was carved into precise segments by the liturgy of the hours, beginning with matins in the deep, pre-dawn blackness when the world outside was still and asleep. The nuns would file into the chapel, their footsteps a soft shuffle on the cold flagstones, their black and gray habits making them look like a procession of shadows. Their voices, raised in plainsong chant, were devoid of earthly emotion, a collective monotone that seemed to rise not from their lungs but from the stones themselves. Sister Abigail, as a novice, was subject to a regime even more rigorous than that of the professed sisters. Her days were a cycle of prayer, manual labor, and study, with scant time for rest or reflection. She slept in a Spartan cell containing only a narrow cot, a small table for her book of hours, and a crucifix of dark, unvarnished wood. The single window looked not down into the verdant valley of her home, but out across the endless, brooding expanse of the forest that stretched to the western horizon. It was a view meant to turn one's thoughts away from the world and towards eternity. The mistress of this silent kingdom was the Reverend Mother Patience. She was a woman who seemed carved from the same granite as her cloister, tall and gaunt, with a face that was a roadmap of asceticism. Her eyes, deep-set and of a flinty gray, missed nothing. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that conveyed absolute authority. It was she who had examined young Abigail Miller's vocation, she who had recognized the girl's fervent, untempered spirit, and she who believed it was her sacred duty to hammer that spirit on the anvil of discipline until it was shaped into a perfect instrument for God's work. Reverend Mother Patience did not believe in a God of mercy and comfort. She served a God of order, judgment, and will, and she demanded the same from every soul under her charge. For Abigail, the strictness of the rule was not a burden, but a strange and welcome relief. The noisy, messy world of Mercy Hollow, with its petty squabbles, its earthly cares, its simple, sensual pleasures, had always felt like a distraction. Here, in the stark silence of the cloister, she felt she could finally hear the voice of God clearly. The fasting that left her stomach cramped and hollow was a purification. The long hours of prayer on cold knees were a testament to her devotion. The relentless schedule that broke down the body felt like the dismantling of the prison of the flesh. She threw herself into the life with a terrifying single-mindedness. While other novices stumbled with fatigue during the night office, Abigail was always alert, her eyes fixed on the sanctuary lamp's flickering flame as if it held the secrets of the universe. During her assigned labor, weaving rough cloth in the workroom or tending the bitter-tasting herbs in the walled garden, her movements were precise, efficient, her mind seemingly turned inward upon some great and consuming mystery. The other sisters, even the stern Reverend Mother, marked her progress with a mixture of awe and unease. Such fervor was a double-edged sword. It could carve a saint or a fanatic, and the line between the two was perilously thin. It was in the cloister's refectory, during the silent meals where communication was done with simple hand signals, that Abigail first felt the full force of a new and unsettling presence. A visiting priest, Father Ignatius, had come to provide spiritual guidance and hear confessions. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, with a lean, hungry look and dark, burning eyes that seemed to pierce through the soul of whoever he gazed upon. When he rose to give the customary reading, his voice was not the gentle, scholarly tone of their usual chaplain. It was a low, resonant instrument, capable of dropping to a conspiratorial whisper one moment and rising to a thunderous declaration the next. He spoke of the world not as a creation to be cherished, but as a fallen edifice, rotting from within. He described sin not as a stumble to be forgiven, but as a contagion that festered in the heart of mankind. And he spoke of God not as a loving father, but as a consuming fire, a divine blacksmith who would one soon day test every soul in his forge, burning away the dross of corruption. As his words filled the silent hall, Sister Abigail felt a strange and powerful sensation, a chilling thrill that ran from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck. It was a feeling far removed from the gentle comfort she found in her mother's embrace or the quiet beauty of the valley's chapel. This was a call to arms. This was a truth that acknowledged the darkness she had always felt lurking at the edges of the world, the sin she fought so hard to scour from her own soul. While the other sisters kept their eyes downcast on their simple fare, Abigail's gaze was locked on Father Ignatius. She felt, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that he was not merely a priest giving a reading. He was a prophet, and he was speaking directly to her. The anvil of discipline within the cloister of St. Jude had just been struck by a new, more forceful hammer, and the nascent blade of Sister Abigail's spirit began to take a sharper, more dangerous edge. The days following Father Ignatius's arrival seemed to contract, the very air within the cloister growing thick and heavy, charged with a new and potent energy. The routine of prayer and labor remained, but its character was irrevocably altered. The gentle, if stern, guidance of their usual chaplain was replaced by a theology of fire and steel. Father Ignatius did not merely lead services. He held court in the chapel, his dark figure a stark silhouette against the simple altar, his voice weaving a tapestry of dread and divine wrath that captivated and terrified in equal measure. He began to preach his new doctrine not just during the scheduled homilies, but in impromptu gatherings in the chapter house, his words spilling out with the fervor of a man who has seen a terrible truth and cannot remain silent. His sermons were no longer abstract discussions of virtue and vice. They were specific, vivid, and apocalyptic. The world slumbers in a bed of its own corruption, he would thunder, his fist striking the wooden lectern for emphasis. It drapes itself in the silks of avarice, gorges itself on the feast of gluttony, and sings the hollow songs of pride. But I say unto you, the trumpet of judgment is even now at the lips of the angel. A great winnowing is at hand. He spoke of a baptism of fire, a concept that seized Sister Abigail's imagination with the force of a revelation. This was not the gentle baptism of water that welcomed a soul into grace. It was a cataclysm. As the deluge once cleansed the world of wickedness, he proclaimed, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the nuns, their features pale and strained in the candlelight, so shall a holocaust of divine origin purge it anew. Not with water, but with flame. It will lick at the foundations of Babylon and reduce the temples of false idols to ash. The righteous shall be refined in this blaze, their faith made pure, while the wicked shall be fuel for the conflagration. Sister Abigail, sitting in her accustomed place, felt these words not as a threat, but as a promise. They gave a name and a purpose to the restless, zealous energy that had always burned within her. The simple, earthy faith of her parents, the faith that thanked God for a good harvest and a healthy child, now seemed hopelessly naive, a child's understanding in the face of an impending storm. Father Ignatius spoke of a God who demanded everything, who would not be satisfied with mere piety, but required a total, purgative sacrifice. In the silence of her cell, his words echoed. The flesh is a prison, sisters, a cage of desire and decay. We must not merely discipline it, we must yearn for its unmaking. To be released from this mortal coil is not to be feared, but to be coveted. It is the final shedding of a filthy garment before stepping into the pure light of his presence. This philosophy seeped into the very fabric of the cloister. The nuns' already austere meals began to feel like indulgences. The warmth of the sun on one's face during a rare walk in the walled garden felt like a sinful pleasure. Abigail found herself scrutinizing her own body with a new, harsh eye. The hunger pangs from her strict fasting were no longer a trial to be endured, but a sweet proof of her mastery over the flesh. The fatigue from long vigils was a badge of honor. She began to seek Father Ignatius out during the times allotted for spiritual direction. In the dim confessional, his voice, a low murmur through the carved screen, felt like a secret shared only with her. "Reverend Father," she whispered one day, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement, "I have such thoughts. When I see the valley below, the smoke rising from the chimneys, I do not see a peaceful community. I see complacency. I see souls grown fat and lazy on God's bounty, with no thought for the judgment to come. Is that a sin? To see the world as he must see it." There was a long pause, and she could almost feel his intense focus through the wooden partition. "Daughter," he said, his voice soft but firm, "what you describe is not a sin. It is a grace. A terrible, fearsome grace. God is opening your eyes. He is showing you the world not as man has made it seem, but as it truly is, a field ripe for the harvest, with much chaff and little wheat. Do not shrink from this vision. Embrace it. It is a sign of his favor." His confirmation was like a key turning in a lock deep within her soul. The unease she felt, the sense of separation from her family and their world, was not a failing. It was a calling, a sacred burden. She was among the few who could see the rot beneath the paint, the worm in the apple. Father Ignatius was the only one who understood this, the only one who could guide her through the terrifying landscape of this new awareness. The other nuns watched this development with a growing apprehension. Some, particularly the older sisters, shook their heads in sorrow, recognizing the dangerous path of spiritual pride and delusion. They saw how Abigail's already pale complexion had taken on a ghostly translucence, how her eyes burned with an unnatural fire. They saw how she now moved through the cloister with a new, unsettling purpose, her devotions taking on a frantic, almost desperate quality. But a handful of others, mostly younger novices like herself, were also drawn to the fiery priest and his electrifying sermons. They saw in Sister Abigail a leader, a pure vessel for this new, potent faith. They began to cluster around her after services, their eyes wide, speaking in hushed tones of Father Ignatius's prophecies. A schism was forming within the stone walls of St. Jude's, invisible to the outside world, but as real and as sharp as a shard of glass. The new doctrine had taken root, and in the fertile soil of Sister Abigail's fervent soul, it was beginning to grow into something dark, twisted, and utterly consuming. The cloister of St. Jude was no longer just a house of prayer, it was becoming a crucible, and Father Ignatius was stoking the flames. The transformation of Sister Abigail, once a gradual turning, now began to accelerate with the grim momentum of a rockslide. The verdant summer, which reached its languid, honeyed peak in Mercy Hollow, held no sway over the stone-bound world of the cloister. For Abigail, the season's beauty became merely another layer of the world's deceptive veneer, a gilded lie laid over a festering truth. The warm breeze that carried the scent of wild honeysuckle through the valley now seemed to her a siren's call, a fragrant temptation meant to lull the soul into a fatal complacency. Her monthly visits home, once a source of solace and a tether to her past life, became instead a source of profound spiritual turmoil. She would descend the winding path from the ridge like a specter entering a feast, her gray habit a smear of ashes against the vibrant green of the hillside. The Miller homestead, which had always been her anchor, now felt like an outpost of the very Babylon Father Ignatius condemned. She sat with her family on the porch one such Sunday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of roasting chicken and the rich, dark earth of her father's fields. Jacob Miller, his face content, spoke of the wheat, which promised to be the best yield in 5 years. "The Lord has been good to us, Abigail," he said, using her childhood name, his hand resting comfortably on his wife's shoulder. "A bountiful harvest means a safe winter for everyone in the hollow." Abigail's hands, folded in her lap, tightened. She did not see divine goodness in the plump grains. She saw an opportunity for gluttony, for the hoarding of wealth, for a false sense of security that turned men's hearts away from the stark reality of salvation. "The Lord provides for our needs, Father," she corrected, her voice unnaturally flat. "But he also warns us against laying up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy. A full barn can be an empty soul's coffin." A silence fell upon the porch. Jacob's smile faded, replaced by a look of puzzled concern. Little Ruth, sensing the shift in mood, stopped her play and clung to her mother's skirts. Abigail's mother, sensing her daughter's distress, tried to bridge the chasm with a woman's touch. "Come, my dear," Abigail Miller said softly, her voice like balm. "Help me with the roses. The aphids have been at the new blooms, and your touch with growing things was always so sure." She led her daughter to the prized rose bushes, a splash of defiant crimson and soft pink against the weathered logs of the cabin. As her mother gently pointed out the afflicted buds, Sister Abigail stared at the flowers. She did not see their beauty or her mother's tender care. She saw vanity. She saw hours wasted in the cultivation of fleeting, worldly beauty while souls hung in the balance. She saw the very embodiment of the flesh, soft, fragrant, and doomed to wither. "They are beautiful, are they not?" her mother murmured, cupping a perfect, velvety bloom. "Beauty is a snare," Abigail replied, her voice cutting through the warm air. "It captures the eye and turns it from God. Why tend to these temporal baubles, Mother, when eternity beckons? When a fire is coming that will consume every leaf and petal until only the truth remains." Her mother recoiled as if struck. "Abigail, what terrible words! These flowers are a gift from God. A small piece of His beauty here on earth. They hurt no one. They bring a moment's joy." "Joy," Abigail echoed, and the words sounded hollow, poisonous on her tongue. A moment's joy in exchange for what? For a soul lulled to sleep? For a heart that grows attached to this world and forgets the next? We are commanded to be in the world, not of it. These roses, they make us of it. The argument that followed was hushed, strained, a desperate attempt by her parents to understand the stranger their daughter had become. They spoke of moderation, of gratitude, of a God who created the world and called it good. But their words were like feathers against the stone wall of her new convictions, built brick by brick from the sermons of Father Ignatius. Later, as she walked back to the cloister, the image of the roses burned behind her eyes, more vivid than the setting sun. That night, in the stark solitude of her cell, she knelt on the cold floor until her knees screamed in protest, praying for strength. She confessed to Father Ignatius the following day her weakness, the flicker of affection she had felt for her family, the residual pleasure she had taken in the warmth of the sun on her skin. "The bonds of blood are the strongest chains of all, daughter," Father Ignatius intoned from the other side of the confessional screen, his voice devoid of comfort. "Satan uses those we love most as his most effective instruments. To love them more than God is idolatry. To prefer their comfort to his truth is a betrayal of the highest order. This struggle you feel, this pain, it is the sound of those chains breaking. Embrace it. Offer it up as a sacrifice." And so she did. She began to meticulously root out every fond memory, every tender feeling for her family and her former life. She reinterpreted her childhood through the harsh new lens of her faith. Her father's hard work was not diligence, but avarice. Her mother's gentle nature was not kindness, but a weak tolerance for sin. The laughter and play of the village children were not innocence, but the unthinking clamor of souls dancing on the lip of hell. The whispers had begun in her own heart, but now they found a voice in the dim corridors of the cloister. She began to speak of her discernment to the small group of novices who hung on Father Ignatius's every word. She described Mercy Hollow not as a community, but as a case study in spiritual decay. She spoke of her own family as the primary example, a household that, for all its outward piety, was mired in the sin of worldliness. "We must pray for them," one of the novices, a frail girl named Sister Ruth, would whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Prayer is not enough," Sister Abigail would reply, her gaze distant, fixed on some internal, terrifying horizon. "We must be prepared to do more. We must be the instruments of their awakening, even if the medicine is bitter, even if the cure is fire." The gentle novice from Mercy Hollow was gone. In her place was a zealot, her soul a vessel slowly filling with a dark and absolute certainty. The whispers were no longer just in her mind, they were becoming a doctrine, shared in secret, building towards a crescendo that would soon demand to be heard by the entire sleeping world below. The warmth of the Miller homestead, once a palpable force of love and security, now felt fragile, like a thin pane of glass over a deepening chasm. Jacob Miller, a man accustomed to reading the weather in the sky and the health of his livestock in their eyes, found himself utterly confounded by the enigma of his own daughter. Her visit had left a chill in the house that the robust kitchen fire could not dispel. After Abigail had departed, walking back up the path to the cloister with a spine as rigid as a poker, a heavy silence descended upon the family. Jacob finally broke it, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant as he tamped tobacco into his pipe. "Abigail," he said to his wife, who was staring blankly at the now cold rose bushes, "what ails the girl? She speaks like one of those hellfire preachers from the camp meetings, all brimstone and doom. There's no light in her eyes. No joy." Abigail Miller wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was mild. "It is more than just fervor, Jacob," she replied, her voice thin with worry. "It is a sickness of the spirit. Did you see how she looked at Ruth? As if our own child's laughter was a sin. And the things she said about my roses, she called them baubles and snares. It is as if she is trying to peel away her own skin, to become something less than human." Young Samuel, who had been listening from the doorway, scuffed his boot against the floor. "She scared me," he mumbled, not meeting his parents' eyes. "She didn't even say goodbye." This simple confession from their son struck Jacob more deeply than any theological argument. His daughter, who had once carried Samuel on her back for hours, who had sung him to sleep with lullabies, was now a source of fear. It was an unnatural inversion, a perversion of the natural order that shook him to his core. The following Sunday, Jacob decided action was needed. He would not go to the cloister, that was a world of women and priests he did not understand, but he would seek counsel from a man of God he did know, Pastor Welby, the minister of the small, whitewashed chapel in Mercy Hollow. Pastor Welby was a man of steady temperament and practical faith, his sermons focusing on charity, forgiveness, and the blessings of daily life. Jacob found the pastor in his study, a small room adjoining the chapel that smelled of old books and beeswax. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Jacob, his hat in his hands, laid out his concerns in his slow, deliberate way. "It's our Abigail, Pastor," he began. "The one at the convent. She comes home, but she isn't there. It's like a ghost wearing her face. She talks of nothing but fire and sin and the end of the world. She looks at her mother's cooking like it's a temptation from the devil himself. She's wasting away to nothing, and she calls it purification." Pastor Welby listened patiently, his kind, wrinkled face growing graver with each word. When Jacob finished, the pastor steepled his fingers. "The path of devotion can be a steep one, Jacob," he said gently, "especially for a young, sensitive soul like Abigail. The cloistered life is one of extreme discipline. It is not uncommon for novices to go through a period of excessive zeal. They set aside the comforts of the world so abruptly that they can, for a time, come to see all comfort as evil. But this is more than that," Jacob insisted, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "She speaks of us, of her own family, as if we're damned. She has a hatred in her eyes, Pastor. A coldness. It ain't right." "I do not believe it is hatred, Jacob," Welby corrected softly. "It is, I fear, a terrible and misguided love. She has become so consumed with the state of her own soul and the souls of others that she sees peril in every earthly joy. It is a form of spiritual pride, one of the most insidious traps for the devout. She believes she sees a higher truth, and in doing so, she has lost sight of the greatest truth of all, that God is love." He promised to make inquiries, to write a discreet letter to the Reverend Mother expressing the family's concerns. But he cautioned Jacob against a direct confrontation. Forcing her to choose between her family and her faith, as she now perceives it, may only drive her deeper into this delusion. We must pray for her, and show her by our own steady, loving example that the God we worship is not a God of terror, but of grace. Jacob left the chapel somewhat comforted by the pastor's words, but the cold knot of anxiety in his stomach remained. Pastor Welby spoke of a phase, an excess of zeal. But Jacob, a man of the land, knew that not all blights were temporary. Some could take root, spreading a rot that killed the plant from the inside out. Meanwhile, Abigail Miller, the mother, waged her own quiet war against the change in her daughter. On the next visiting day, when Sister Abigail descended the path, her mother was waiting with a small basket. Inside was not the usual honey cake or fresh bread, but a simple, leather-bound journal and a new inkpot. "I thought you might like this, my dear," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "To write down your thoughts. Your prayers. Sometimes putting things on paper can clarify them." Sister Abigail took the basket, her expression unreadable. She did not thank her mother, but merely nodded. Later, in her cell, she would open the journal. But she would not use it to record doubts or fond memories. Instead, she began to transcribe the most terrifying passages from Father Ignatius's sermons and to chronicle, in stark, unforgiving prose, the sins of Mercy Hollow as she now perceived them. The gift of love had been twisted into a weapon for her fanaticism. The chasm was widening, and the whispers from the ridge were growing louder, drowning out the gentle, desperate pleas from the home that had once loved her. The oppressive heat of a Virginia August lay upon the land like a suffocating blanket. Within the stone walls of St. Jude's, the air was thick and motionless, heavy with the scent of old incense, beeswax, and the faint, metallic tang of perspiration. It was during the long, silent hours of the midday office of Sext that the first crack in the fabric of Sister Abigail's reality appeared. The nuns were gathered in the choir stalls, their voices a low, weary drone as they chanted the psalms. The sun, a furious white eye, beat down upon the slate roof, heating the chapel until it felt like a bread oven. Sister Abigail, kneeling in her assigned place, felt a wave of dizziness pass over her. The Latin words on the page before her blurred and swam. The monotonous chant of her sisters seemed to recede, replaced by a high, piercing whine that grew inside her skull. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, attributing the episode to the heat and her rigorous fasting. But when she opened them again, the chapel was transformed. The familiar, stark interior was gone. Instead, she stood at the edge of a great, desolate plain under a sky the color of bruised flesh. The air tasted of ash and ozone. Before her stood a figure of terrifying majesty. It was tall, its form seeming to be woven from smoke and shifting light, and in its hand, it held a sword that burned with a cold, blue-white flame. There was no face, only an overwhelming sense of purpose and judgment that radiated from it like heat from a forge. A voice, not heard with the ears but felt in the very marrow of her bones, resonated through her being. It was a sound of grinding stones and cleaving metal. "The harvest is ripe, but the workers are few. The time of the cleansing fire is at hand. You must prepare. You must be my instrument. The dross must be burned away." The vision lasted only a heartbeat, perhaps two. A sharp gasp from the sister next to her jolted Abigail back to the present. She found herself slumped forward in the stall, her knuckles white where she gripped the wooden ledge, her habit drenched in a cold sweat. The chanting had faltered, all eyes were upon her. Reverend Mother Patience was standing, her flinty gaze fixed on Abigail with an expression of severe scrutiny. "Sister Abigail," the Reverend Mother's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Are you unwell?" Abigail could barely form words. Her body trembled violently. "I saw," she stammered, her voice a thin reed. "You are faint from the heat and your own indiscipline," the Reverend Mother declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Sister Beatrice, assist her to the infirmary. She is to take broth and rest. This is the fruit of excess, not of grace." Humiliated and shaken, Abigail was led from the chapel. But as she lay on the hard cot in the infirmary, the terror of the vision began to curdle into a wild, exultant joy. The Reverend Mother was wrong. This was not a product of a weakened body. It was a summons from a higher plane. God had not spoken to her in the gentle voice of Pastor Welby. He had sent a warrior angel with a flaming sword. He had chosen her. As soon as she was able, she sought out Father Ignatius. She found him in the sacristy, carefully polishing the communion chalice. She fell to her knees before him, the words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless torrent. She described the desolate plain, the faceless angel, the burning sword, and the terrible, glorious command. Father Ignatius listened in utter silence, his polishing cloth stilled. When she finished, he did not rush to dismiss her or prescribe rest. He set the chalice down with deliberate care and looked at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that mirrored her own. "Describe the flame," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "It was cold," she whispered, her eyes wide. "It burned, but it gave no heat. It was the color of the heart of a lightning strike." A slow, grim smile spread across Father Ignatius's thin lips. It was not a smile of warmth, but of vindication. "The seraphim," he breathed. "The highest order. The burning ones who attend the very throne of God. They are not messengers of comfort, daughter. They are the executors of his divine wrath. You have been granted a great and terrible honor." He placed a hand on her head, and a fresh tremor went through her. "Do you understand now? The time is not coming. It is here." The angel did not say, fire, but the cleansing fire. "You are not merely a witness. You are chosen to be an instrument. This is the confirmation we have been praying for." His interpretation was like a key turning in the final lock. The fear, the dizziness, the overwhelming power of the encounter, it all now made a terrible, perfect sense. She was not ill, she was anointed. The Reverend Mother's skepticism was merely the world's resistance to the divine will, just as her family's love was a chain trying to bind her to a sinking ship. From that day forward, Sister Abigail was changed. The pale, devout novice was gone, replaced by a figure of gaunt, feverish intensity. The vision became the cornerstone of her reality. She spoke of it constantly to her small circle of followers, her voice dropping to a reverent hush as she described the angelic mandate. The other nuns gave her a wide berth, crossing themselves when she passed. The cloister of St. Jude was no longer just a house of prayer. It had become the headquarters for an impending apocalypse, and Sister Abigail was its self-proclaimed prophetess. The flame that had been kindled by Father Ignatius's sermons had now been fanned into an inferno by a vision from the abyss itself, and it would not be long before that fire sought its fuel in the world of men. The vision of the angelic herald became the unshakable bedrock upon which Sister Abigail's new reality was built. It was a secret, burning coal nestled deep within her soul, and its heat fueled a transformation that was both mesmerizing and horrifying to witness. The daily rhythms of the cloister, once the entire focus of her existence, now felt like a tedious pretense, a series of meaningless gestures performed while waiting for the curtain to rise on the final, apocalyptic act. Her devotion curdled into a focused, predatory intensity. She moved through the stone corridors like a blade being sharpened, her every action, every prayer, now bent towards a single, terrifying purpose: preparation for the cleansing fire. It was in this state of heightened, feverish anticipation that Father Ignatius drew her deeper into his confidence. He summoned her one evening after Compline, not to the confessional, but to a small, windowless antechamber behind the chapel's altar, a room used for storing vestments and sacred vessels. The air was close, smelling of cedar and old incense. A single candle on a rough-hewn table cast leaping shadows upon the stone walls. He was not alone. 3 other novices were there, their faces pale and solemn in the flickering light. Sister Ruth, the frail girl who hung on Abigail's every word; Sister Constance, a stocky, severe girl with a jaw like granite; and Sister Mercy, whose name belied a nature of fierce, unforgiving zeal. They were the ones most swayed by his sermons, the ones who had clustered around Abigail. They were the chosen. "The time for whispers is over," Father Ignatius began, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The world sleeps, but we must be awake. The angel has spoken, not to the complacent in the valley, not to the doubters in this very house, but to one of our own. The call for a vanguard has been issued." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze of physical weight. "You few have been selected. You have shown the strength to see the corruption that others call life. You have the will to embrace the harsh truths that others dismiss as excess. You are to be the core of a new order within this old, failing one. You are the Sisters of the Ember. The name hung in the air, charged and potent. An ember, a small, glowing piece of coal or wood in a dying fire. It was a perfect symbol of their perceived role, a seemingly insignificant spark hidden within the ashes of the old world, holding the potential to ignite the promised conflagration. Your rule will be stricter than that of this cloister, Ignatius continued, his eyes burning. Your prayers will be more fervent, your penances more severe. You will meet here, in secret, after the last office of the day. You will hold your own vigils. You will train your spirits for the trial to come. The world will be baptized in fire, and we must be the ones to carry the torch, lest the flames consume us as well. He laid out their covenant. They would undertake additional fasts, consuming only bread and water on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They would practice a discipline of silence amongst themselves during daylight hours, saving their speech for their secret meetings and their prayers. And most chillingly, they would incorporate a new form of penance, the mortification of the flesh. From a small chest, Father Ignatius produced several disciplines, short whips of knotted leather cords. When the flesh screams in protest, he instructed, his voice devoid of emotion, when it begs for comfort and ease, you must silence it. You must show it who is master. Every sting, every drop of blood, is a prayer. It is a declaration that the spirit is willing even if the flesh is weak. It is the forging of a will strong enough to do what must be done. He led them in their first ritual. The 5 of them knelt on the cold stone floor. Father Ignatius began a prayer in Latin, not the gentle plainsong of the choir, but a harsh, guttural chant. On his signal, they took up the disciplines and, turning their backs to one another in a grim parody of modesty, began to scourge themselves. The first bite of the leather against the tender skin of her back elicited a sharp, involuntary cry from Sister Abigail. It was a pain unlike any she had ever known, sharp, personal, and degrading. But as the blows fell in rhythm with Father Ignatius's chanting, the pain began to transform. It became a fire that burned away doubt, that consumed fear, that purified her of any last, lingering attachment to the weak vessel of her body. The sting was a focus, a point of intense sensation that drove everything else from her mind, the memory of her mother's face, the sound of her brother's laughter, the scent of roses. There was only the pain, the chant, and the glorious, terrible purpose. When it was over, she was trembling, bathed in a cold sweat, her back a map of fiery lines. But she also felt a wild, dizzying elation. She had passed a test. She had looked into the abyss of her own suffering and had not flinched. She looked at the others. Sister Ruth was weeping silently, but her eyes shone with a fervent light. Sister Constance's jaw was clenched, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. Father Ignatius anointed each of their foreheads with a drop of sacred chrism. You are no longer merely novices of St. Jude, he intoned. You are the Sisters of the Ember. You are the keepers of the sacred fire. You are the instruments of the coming purification. Let no one, not Reverend Mother, not your family, not your own weak hearts, turn you from this path. As Sister Abigail returned to her cell in the dead of night, the pain from her wounds was a constant, throbbing reminder of her new identity. The secret was now a physical part of her, etched into her flesh. The sect was born, a cabal of 5 souls festering in the heart of the cloister, their faith twisted into a weapon, their piety into a pathology. They were a cancer, and they believed themselves to be the cure. And in the center of it all was Sister Abigail, the visionary, the bride of the Ember, her soul now fully and irrevocably given over to the darkness that masqueraded as divine light. The air in the Miller homestead, once a haven of unspoken understanding and easy affection, had grown thin and brittle. Each visit from their daughter was now a trial to be endured, a fresh assault on their hearts. The vibrant colors of late summer, the gold of the wheat fields, the deep blue of the sky, the defiant crimson of Abigail Miller's roses, seemed to mock the gray pallor that had settled over their family life. Jacob's face was etched with new lines of worry, and Abigail's gentle eyes were perpetually shadowed with a sorrow too deep for words. On the last Sunday of August, Sister Abigail descended the path from the cloister. The change in her was now so pronounced it was almost a physical blow. Her habit hung loose on a frame grown skeletal from relentless fasting. Her skin was translucent, stretched taut over the sharp architecture of her cheekbones, and the dark hollows beneath her eyes were like smudges of soot. But it was her eyes themselves that were the most terrible alteration. The stillness they had once held was gone, replaced by a feverish, almost predatory glitter, a light that saw not the world as it was, but as a text to be deciphered for signs of sin and imminent judgment. The family meal was a silent, funereal affair. The succulent roast chicken, the fresh-baked bread, the sweet butter churn that morning, all were met with Sister Abigail's dispassionate gaze. She picked at the food as if it were ashes on her tongue. Little Ruth, trying to bridge the chasm with a child's innocence, chattered about a new litter of kittens in the barn. Sister Abigail listened, her expression unmoved. "They are creatures of instinct, little sister," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "They know nothing of salvation or damnation. Their lives are a brief, meaningless spark. Do not grow too attached to temporal things." Ruth's face fell, her lower lip trembling. Jacob's knife clattered loudly against his plate. "Abigail," he said, his voice strained with the effort to remain calm. "They are kittens. They are God's creatures, meant for a child's joy. Must you find darkness in everything?" "I find the truth, Father," she replied, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "And the truth is that this world and all its pleasures are passing away. We must be prepared to let it all go." After the tense meal, Abigail Miller, her heart aching, sought to find some common ground, some remnant of the daughter she had raised. She led Sister Abigail out to the rose garden, the place that had always been their sanctuary. The bushes were a riot of late summer glory, the blooms heavy and fragrant, their petals soft as velvet. "See," her mother said softly, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion as she cupped a perfect, sunset orange bloom. "Even as the season wanes, there is beauty. It is a reminder of God's enduring grace, His promise of renewal." Sister Abigail stared at the flower, and a spasm of something like revulsion crossed her gaunt features. The rose, in its perfect, sensual beauty, seemed to embody everything she had been taught to abhor: the vanity of the flesh, the seduction of the senses, the attachment to a dying world. It was no longer a symbol of her mother's love, but a gaudy idol, a trap for the soul. "Grace?" she echoed, her voice sharp as a shard of glass. "This is not grace, Mother. This is vanity. This is hours of labor wasted on a fleeting spectacle that will be dust in a fortnight. It is a distraction from the only thing that matters, the state of our immortal souls." Before her horrified mother could react, Sister Abigail's hand, thin and white as a talon, shot out. She did not gently touch the bloom. She seized it, crushing the delicate petals in her fist, her nails digging into the stem. With a violent, wrenching motion, she tore the rose from the bush. Then she threw it to the ground and stamped on it, grinding the vibrant orange into the dark dirt until it was a pulpy, colorless stain. "There!" she hissed, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a terrifying light. "There is its true end. Ashes and corruption. Why do you cling to it? Why do you worship it?" Abigail Miller let out a small, wounded cry, as if she herself had been struck. "My rose, my beautiful," she whispered, staring at the ruined flower. Then her gaze lifted to her daughter's face, and the sorrow in her eyes hardened into a flash of maternal fury. "How dare you?" she breathed, her voice shaking with a rage born of profound hurt. "How dare you come into my home and destroy what I have nurtured with love? Is this the charity your cloister teaches? Is this the God you serve, a God of hatred and destruction?" The dam of strained civility broke. Jacob, hearing the raised voices, rushed from the house. He took in the scene: his wife, pale and trembling, the mutilated rose on the ground, and his daughter standing over it like an avenging angel, her face a mask of righteous fury. "That is enough. Jacob roared, his voice echoing across the quiet yard. He strode forward, pointing a thick, calloused finger towards the path that led back to the ridge. I will not have this poison in my home. I will not have you speaking to your mother in such a manner. You have chosen your path, daughter. You have chosen that stone prison and the words of that mad priest over your own family. So go. Go back to them. But do not come back here to spread your misery and your hate. You are no longer welcome under this roof until you remember what it means to be a daughter, and a sister, and a human being. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Sister Abigail did not weep. She did not plead. A strange, cold calm settled over her. She looked from her father's enraged face to her mother's devastated one, and she saw them not as her parents, but as obstacles. As enemies of the divine truth she served. The last chain had been snapped. So be it, she said, her voice eerily flat. You have cast your lot with the world. You have chosen your thorns and your fading flowers. Do not weep for me when the fire comes. You have had your warning. She turned and walked away, not with the hurried steps of a chastised child, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a martyr leaving her persecutors. She did not look back. As she disappeared up the path into the gathering shadows of the woods, Abigail Miller collapsed against her husband, her body racked with sobs. The rejection was complete. The daughter they had loved was gone, and in her place was a stranger, a fanatic who saw their love as a sin and their home as a monument to idolatry. The break was clean, and it was fatal. The rejection by her family did not break Sister Abigail. It was the final, necessary tempering of her soul. The last, fragile bridge to her old life had been burned, and the resulting isolation was not a prison but a liberation. She returned to the cloister of St. Jude not as a chastened daughter, but as a confirmed prophetess, a soldier who had faced the enemy in its most seductive form, familial love, and had emerged victorious. The pain of the confrontation was transmuted, through the alchemy of her fanaticism, into righteous certainty. Her parents were no longer her family. They were the first-named souls on the ledger of the damned, a living testament to the world's corruption that she was destined to purify. Within the secret circle of the Sisters of the Ember, her status was now unassailable. Her account of the confrontation was received not with pity, but with awe. She had faced the ultimate temptation and had not faltered. Father Ignatius praised her strength, calling her rejection a holy divorce from the world. Her self-inflicted penances grew more severe, the sessions in the vestry chamber longer and more intense. The knotted leather of the discipline was no longer just a tool for mortification. It was a whetstone, sharpening her will for the great task to come. The humid, languid days of late summer began to crisp into the clear, cool nights of early autumn. The harvest in Mercy Hollow was in full, frantic swing. The air, which had once carried the scent of roses and warm earth, now smelled of chaff, of apples pressed for cider, and of wood smoke from the first fires of the season. In the valley, it was a time of joyous exhaustion, of communal labor and the satisfaction of a year's work coming to fruition. On the ridge, the Sisters of the Ember watched this activity not as a celebration, but as a final, frantic gathering of stores for a winter that would never come. Then, on a night so clear the Milky Way was a shimmering river of dust across the velvet blackness, the sign appeared. It was during the midnight office of matins. The nuns were in their stalls, their voices a weary drone in the vast, dark silence of the chapel. Suddenly, a brilliant, greenish-white light flared outside the narrow windows, casting the interior into stark, momentary relief, freezing the chant in 100 throats. It was not the gentle streak of a common shooting star. This was a celestial body of immense size and terrifying slowness, a great smoldering ember dragged across the face of heaven. Its head was a blazing ball of cold fire, and it trailed a tail of shimmering opalescent light that seemed to writhe like a serpent as it passed. It moved from north to south in a terrible, silent procession, and for a long minute, its unearthly glow drowned out the stars. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed in the chapel. Several of the older nuns fell to their knees, clutching their rosaries and whispering prayers to the Virgin for protection. It was an omen, a portent of a scale that dwarfed human understanding. But in the antechamber, where the Sisters of the Ember had been conducting their own vigil, the reaction was one of ecstatic terror. Sister Ruth let out a small, choked cry and pointed a trembling finger at the window. Sister Constance merely stared, her granite jaw slack with awe. Father Ignatius, who had been leading them in a prayer of preparation, fell silent, his face uplifted, his dark eyes reflecting the comet's baleful light. He slowly raised his hands, his voice a tremulous, triumphant whisper that built into a roar. "Behold! The herald of fire! The torch is lit in the heavens! The time of waiting is over!" He turned to them, his figure seeming to grow in the unearthly glow. "This is the final confirmation. The angel's sword was but a promise. This is the proclamation. The baptism is at hand. The furnace of the Lord is prepared." Sister Abigail felt a jolt course through her, a sensation so powerful it was almost sexual. This was no private vision, open to the doubt of the Reverend Mother. This was a sign written across the cosmos, visible to all, yet its true meaning decipherable only to them, the chosen. The cold, burning flame of the comet was the very image of the angel's sword made manifest on a celestial scale. It was a command, a summons, a starting pistol fired from the throne of God. The following days were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. The public life of the cloister continued, but beneath the surface, the sect moved with a new, frantic purpose. The comet, which the valley folk spoke of with superstitious unease and the local newspaper called a wondrous astronomical event, became the central fact of their existence. Father Ignatius interpreted its passing not as a natural phenomenon, but as a divine timer, counting down the seconds to apocalypse. He gathered the Sisters of the Ember in the deepest cellar of the convent, a place rarely visited, where the air was damp and the only light came from a single, guttering torch he carried himself. "The world will not understand," he told them, his voice echoing off the mossy stone. "They will see the sign and yet remain blind. Our duty is now clear. We must be the kindling. We must be the spark that answers the fire in the sky. We must prepare the sacrifice." He laid out the final plan. They would need the means of ignition: lamp oil from the convent stores, pitch from the village cooper, anything that would feed a hungry flame. They would gather it here, in this forgotten space, building their pyre in the very bowels of the religious house that had sheltered them. "The night of the next new moon," Father Ignatius declared, his eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "When the sky is at its blackest, and the world is shrouded in its deepest sleep. That is when we will act. That is when we will bring the fire of heaven down to earth." The omen had been given. The course was set. The Sisters of the Ember, their hearts pounding with a terrifying mix of dread and exultation, began their final, grim preparations. They were no longer just praying for the end, they were now its architects. The comet faded from the sky, but its image was seared into their minds, a constant, burning reminder of their holy, horrible destiny. The world, in its mundane blindness, soon forgot the comet. It became a 9-days wonder, a topic for a few more evenings around the hearth before the practical concerns of harvest and the coming winter reclaimed everyone's attention. But in the deep cellar of St. Jude's, the memory of the celestial fire was a living, breathing entity, fed by fear, fanaticism, and the grim resolve of the 5 souls who saw themselves as the instruments of its earthly counterpart. The cellar was their true cloister now, a realm of shadows and secrets. The air, thick with the smell of damp stone, earth, and the sharp, resinous scent of stolen pitch, was their incense. The feeble light of a single, shielded lantern, which Father Ignatius decreed was all they would use, cast their looming, distorted shadows upon the walls, turning their gatherings into a danse macabre. The neatly stacked containers of lamp oil and the sticky, black barrels of pitch were their sacred relics, the raw materials of salvation. Days were spent in a state of heightened, nerve-fraying anticipation. Sister Abigail moved through the formal routines of the cloister like an automaton, her body present for the offices and labors, but her spirit was down in the cellar, amidst the tools of apocalypse. Every mouthful of bread during their meager meals felt like a betrayal of their coming fast. Every moment of sunlight was a delay of the necessary, purifying darkness. The new moon was a little over a week away, and its approach was a clock ticking in the very marrow of their bones. On the night of the covenant, the atmosphere in the cellar was electric, a storm about to break. Father Ignatius stood before them, his face a mask of solemn ecstasy. He had laid a rough, homespun linen cloth upon a large, flat stone that served as their altar. Upon it rested a simple, pewter chalice, the one used for the wine of the Eucharist, which he had taken from the sacristy. "My daughters," he began, his voice a low thrum that vibrated in the cold air. "The hour of our sanctification is upon us. The world slumbers in its sin, but we are awake. We have been chosen, set apart, not for our own glory, but for the glory of Him who sends the fire. Tonight, we seal our covenant. We swear to be His hands, His torch, His unflinching will." He produced a small, sharp knife from the folds of his cassock. It was not a ritual dagger, but a common skinning knife, its utilitarian nature making the act to come feel more visceral, more real. "We have scourged our flesh to prove our spirit's mastery," he said, his gaze sweeping over them. "But words are air. Blood is testament. A covenant written in blood is a covenant that cannot be broken, that binds us to our purpose through eternity." He held out his own left palm. Without a flicker of hesitation, he drew the blade across his flesh. A dark, red line welled up, beating and then overflowing to run in a thin stream down his wrist. He held his hand over the chalice, letting his blood drip into the silver cup, the sound a soft, steady plink in the utter silence. "Sister Constance," he commanded. The stocky novice stepped forward, her jaw set. She took the knife, her hand steady, and mirrored his action. Her blood joined his in the chalice. Then came Sister Mercy, her eyes burning with fervor, and then the trembling but resolute Sister Ruth. Finally, it was Abigail's turn. She took the knife. The handle was cold, the metal still smeared with the blood of her sisters. She looked at her own palm, at the pale, unmarked skin. This was the final surrender, the ultimate renunciation of the life she had been born into. The body that had been nurtured by her mother's food, that had been warmed by her father's hugs, that had run through the fields of Mercy Hollow. This was its final repudiation. She pressed the blade to her flesh. The pain was sharp and clean, a bright, searing line. She watched, mesmerized, as her blood, the blood of the Miller line, welled up and fell, drop by drop, into the communal cup, mingling with that of her new, true family. Father Ignatius took the chalice. He raised it high, the dark, swirling liquid within looking black in the dim light. "By this blood, we are bound," he intoned, his voice rising to a chant. "By this oath, we are sworn. We are the sisters of the Ember, the kindling of the Lord's wrath. We shall not turn aside. We shall not falter. We shall be the fire that cleanses this corrupted earth. Our lives are forfeit, our wills are His. So swear we all." He brought the chalice to his lips and drank. He passed it to Sister Constance, who drank without flinching. Then to Sister Mercy, then to Sister Ruth, who gagged slightly but swallowed. Finally, he held it out to Sister Abigail. She took the chalice. It was warm from their hands. The metallic, coppery smell of blood filled her nostrils. This was the true communion, the antithesis of the gentle Eucharist of her childhood faith. This was not a symbol of grace and forgiveness, it was a pact of destruction. She closed her eyes, tipped the chalice, and drank. The taste was shocking, primal, and utterly profane. It was the taste of iron and salt and a terrible, binding power. As the blood passed her lips, she felt a final, internal door slam shut and lock. There was no going back. She was no longer Sister Abigail, novice of St. Jude. She was the bride of the Ember, anointed in blood, sworn to fire. Father Ignatius took the empty chalice from her. A terrible, radiant smile broke across his face. "It is done," he whispered. "The covenant is sealed. Now we wait for the darkness. And when it is complete, we will bring the light." A new and potent silence descended upon the cloister of St. Jude in the days that followed the midnight covenant. It was not the peaceful quiet of contemplation, but the hushed, watchful stillness of a predator stalking its prey. The five bound by blood moved through the routines of the house like ghosts, their interactions with the other nuns reduced to the barest minimum required by the rule. Their eyes, when they met, held a shared, terrifying knowledge, a secret that set them apart as starkly as if they were surrounded by a wall of glass. The focus of their existence narrowed to a single, grim objective: the accumulation of the means of ignition. The plan, meticulously laid out by Father Ignatius, was both simple and audacious. They would need a great quantity of combustibles to ensure the baptism by fire was swift, thorough, and inescapable. The new moon was their deadline, and their clandestine stockpile in the deep cellar was growing, but too slowly. The first source was the convent itself. The lamp oil, a precious commodity stored in a locked closet off the kitchen, was their initial target. Sister Constance, whose strength and severe demeanor intimidated the gentle sister in charge of the larder, was tasked with this. She would wait until the dead of night, after the great silence had fallen, and using a key Father Ignatius had somehow procured, she would slip into the closet. The heavy, tin containers of whale oil were cumbersome, and moving them without sound was a nerve-wracking ordeal. The slow, sloshing sound of the liquid within seemed deafening in the profound quiet of the sleeping house. She would carry them one by one down the winding stone stairs to the cellar, her muscles straining, her ears straining for any sign that they had been discovered. Each container placed beside the others was a small victory, a brick laid in the wall of their terrible purpose. But the convent's supplies were limited. For the true, all-consuming blaze they envisioned, they needed something more potent, something that would cling and spread. They needed pitch. This task fell to Sister Abigail and Sister Mercy. The village of Mercy Hollow had a cooper, a skilled craftsman named Elias Pike, who supplied barrels to the whole county. His workshop, a small, open-sided shed on the outskirts of the settlement, was where he stored his raw materials: great, sticky blocks of pine pitch and barrels of tar. It was a place of strong, acrid smells and casual disarray, a world away from the sterile order of the cloister. Their first foray into the village under the cover of darkness was a descent into a different world. The familiar sights of Mercy Hollow, the chapel, the trading post, the lane that led to her parents' farm, were rendered alien and sinister by the moonless night. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching eye, every rustle in the undergrowth was the sound of approaching discovery. The air, which usually carried the comforting scents of hearth smoke and baking bread, was now cold and empty, carrying only the damp chill of the river. They moved like wraiths, keeping to the deepest shadows, their dark habits making them nearly invisible. Sister Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a strange, illicit excitement. This was not a visit home, this was a raid on the enemy. The darkened windows of the houses were not the eyes of sleeping neighbors, but the blind, shuttered portals of a condemned city. Elias Pike's workshop was unlocked, as was the custom in the trusting community. The smell of fresh-cut wood and pine resin was overpowering. Inside, they found what they sought: a half-empty barrel of thick, black tar and several smaller buckets filled with hardened pitch. The work was messy and difficult. The tar was viscous and heavy, clinging to the dipper and the sides of the clay jugs they had brought. The hardened pitch had to be broken into smaller, manageable chunks with a hammer and chisel they had taken from the convent's tool shed, each sharp crack seeming to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. As she worked, her hands becoming smeared with the black, sticky substance, Sister Abigail's gaze was drawn across the field to the silhouette of her family's home. A single, faint light glowed in a window, likely her mother, unable to sleep, sewing by candlelight. A memory, sharp and unbidden, flashed in her mind. Her mother's hands, not stained with pitch, but deftly and lovingly tending her rose bushes, the soil dark and rich under her fingers. The image was of physical pain, a phantom limb of a life amputated. She clenched her jaw, forcing the memory down, drowning it in the rising tide of her fanaticism. That light was not a beacon of home, it was the campfire of the opposition. The love it represented was the very chain she had sworn to break. They filled their sacks with the chunks of pitch and their jugs with the tar, the weight a tangible promise of the destruction to come. The journey back up the ridge was a nightmare of straining muscles and heightened senses. Every cracking twig was a footstep, Every call of a night bird was a shouted alarm. But they were not discovered. The village slept on, blissfully ignorant of the two dark figures moving through its heart, carrying the seeds of its annihilation. Back in the cellar, they added their hull to the growing pile. The smell of the pitch now mingled permanently with the damp and the oil, creating a unique, unholy perfume that clung to their habits and their skin. It was the smell of their mission, the scent of the coming fire. The thefts continued over the next several nights, a silent, systematic pilfering from the community that had raised her. With each successful trip, Sister Abigail felt a part of her old self slew away, like dead skin. The novice who had once prayed for gentle grace was gone, replaced by a determined arsonist, her soul as black and ready to burn as the pitch she carried in her hands. The pyre was nearly built. All that remained was to wait for the appointed hour, when the darkness would be absolute, and the world would be offered up as a sacrifice. A profound and unshakable conviction had taken root in Abigail Miller's heart. The figure who now occupied her daughter's form was lost, adrift on a sea of fanaticism, and she, the mother, was the only one who could yet throw a lifeline. The memory of their last, terrible confrontation, of the crushed Rose and her husband's furious banishment, haunted her waking hours and poisoned her dreams. She could not, would not, let that be the final chapter. The love she bore for her firstborn was a force more stubborn than dogma, more resilient than despair. And so, against Jacob's grim advice and with a prayer on her lips, she resolved to make one last, desperate pilgrimage to the cloister of St. Jude. She chose a day when the sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind of day that made the world seem eternally new and full of promise. She wore her best dress, a simple but well-made gown of navy calico, and carried a small basket. Inside was not food or a journal this time, but a single, perfect white rose from her garden, its petals flawless and unfurled, a symbol of peace and perhaps, of surrender. The walk up the ridge was longer and steeper than she remembered, each step a conscious effort against the weight of her dread. The imposing stone structure seemed to glare down at her, its narrow windows like suspicious eyes. She was received at the gate by a young, timid lay sister who directed her to a small, bleak parlor just inside the entrance, a room reserved for visitors that held no comfort, only a stark table and two hardback chairs. The air was cold and smelled of stone and stale incense. She waited for what felt an eternity, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the white rose lying on the table between her and the empty chair. Finally, the door opened, and Sister Abigail entered. The sight of her struck Abigail Miller with a physical force. Her daughter had grown even thinner, if that were possible. The habit hung from her shoulders like a shroud, and her face was a bloodless mask, all sharp bone and translucent skin. But it was her eyes that truly undid the mother. They held a flat, polished calm, like the surface of a deep, frozen lake, devoid of any recognition or warmth. "Mother," Sister Abigail said, her voice as neutral as if she were addressing a stranger. "You should not have come." Father was clear. "He is your father, Abigail," she replied, her own voice trembling despite her resolve. "And I am your mother. That cannot be undone by words, no matter how harshly spoken." She gestured to the rose. "I brought you this. A white rose for peace. For a new beginning. Please, my darling girl. Look at what this place is doing to you. You are fading away before my eyes. This is not piety. This is a sickness of the soul." Sister Abigail's gaze flickered to the rose, and for a fleeting second, Abigail Miller saw a flicker of something. A memory, a ghost of the girl who had loved beauty. But it was extinguished instantly, replaced by a cold, dismissive hardness. "The soul is all that matters," Sister Abigail stated, her tone didactic. "The body is a vessel of corruption, a temporary shell. To cling to it, to adorn it, to weep for its decline, is to worship the temporary and deny the eternal. This flower is a lie. Its beauty is a deception that masks the decay inherent in all living things. It is a gift of love," Abigail Miller insisted, her desperation breaking through. "It is the only language I have left to speak to you. Can you not see that? Can you not feel the love that brought me here, that defies your father's anger and my own fear? This coldness, this is not the God I know. The God I know is love. He is the comfort for the afflicted, the father to the orphan, the source of every good and perfect gift, like the beauty of this rose. She reached out, her hand hovering over her daughter's clenched fist on the table. It was a gesture that had once brought instant comfort, a silent promise of safety. Sister Abigail recoiled as if from a venomous snake. "Do not," she hissed, her frozen composure cracking to reveal the fanaticism beneath. "Your love is a chain. Your God of comfort is an idol for the weak, a fiction to soothe those who lack the strength to face the terrible, glorious truth. There is a fire coming, Mother, a purifying fire that will consume every rose, every home, every fleeting comfort. It is the only true love, a love that burns away all falsehood, all sin, all attachment to this doomed world." Her voice dropped to a fervent, chilling whisper. "I have seen it. I have been chosen to help usher it in, to warn the few who will listen. You have been warned. Do not mourn for what must be. Rejoice that the truth, however terrible, will soon be revealed to all." Abigail Miller stared, her hope shattering into a million pieces. She was not speaking to her daughter. She was listening to a stranger, a zealot who had built a fortress of dogma around her heart and saw her mother's love as a siege weapon. The white rose on the table seemed to mock her, its purity a stark contrast to the spiritual corruption that sat before her. She slowly, stiffly rose to her feet. The fight had gone out of her, leaving behind a hollow, aching grief. "Then I have lost you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "My child, my firstborn, is gone." Sister Abigail also stood, her posture once again rigid and impersonal. "I was never truly yours," she replied. "I was always his. Go in peace, Mother, and prepare your soul." Abigail Miller turned and walked out of the parlor, out of the cloister gate, and back down the path. She did not look back. The white rose remained on the table, a forgotten offering to a god of ash and silence. The final visit was over. The last bridge was not just burned, it had been annihilated. And as the mother descended into the valley, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest, she carried with her the terrifying certainty that her daughter was not just lost, but had become the herald of something monstrous. The warning had been given, not from a mother to a daughter, but from a prophetess of doom to a citizen of a world she had already condemned to the flame. The moon, a great, lopsided orb of burnished gold, hung fat and heavy in the autumn sky. In Mercy Hollow, it was the night of the harvest festival, a tradition as old as the settlement itself. The hard, back-breaking work of the harvest was done. The granaries were full, the root cellars packed, the cider barrels sealed. Now was the time for gratitude, for community, for the simple, earthy joy of survival. The center of the village, the grassy common before the chapel, was alive with light and noise. Great bonfires roared, their sparks swirling up to compete with the stars. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of the communal feast. Smoked hams, roasted chickens, great wheels of cheese, loaves of fresh bread, and an abundance of pies and cakes. Fiddles sawed out lively reels, and the sound of laughter and dancing feet filled the cool night air. Children, hopped up on sugar and excitement, wove through the crowds playing tag, their shrieks of delight echoing into the darkness. Jacob Miller stood with a group of other farmers, a mug of hard cider in his hand, but his heart wasn't in the celebration. His eyes kept drifting from the firelit faces of his neighbors to the dark, brooding line of the ridge where the cloister of St. Jude perched. His wife, Abigail, sat on a bench near the food tables, forcing a smile as she accepted compliments on her pies, but her gaze was distant, haunted. The empty space where their daughter should have been was a palpable void between them, a chill that the bonfires could not warm. On that same ridge, the scene was one of stark and terrifying contrast. The cloister of St. Jude was a tomb, its windows dark, its inhabitants engaged in the great silence. But deep within its stone belly, in the cellar that reeked of oil and pitch, a different kind of ceremony was beginning. Father Ignatius stood before the Sisters of the Ember, his face a grim mask in the light of a single shuttered lantern. The sounds of the festival, faint, ghostly strains of music and the occasional carried laugh filtered down to them, a mocking serenade from a world they were about to condemn. "Do you hear it?" Ignatius whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "The sound of Babylon reveling on the eve of its destruction. They feast on the bounty of a god they have forgotten. They dance on the edge of the abyss. Their joy is a blasphemy." He gestured to the materials stacked against the wall, the containers of oil, the jugs of tar, the chunks of pitch. "Tonight, the moon is full, a symbol of their worldly completion. But soon the sky will be black. The new moon approaches, the time of endings and beginnings. That is when we will act. But tonight we make our final preparations. We consecrate our tools." From a sack, he produced 4 torches, stout wooden staves wrapped in rags. He also laid out 4 small, earthenware pots with narrow necks, the kind used for storing oil. "These are not mere tools," he intoned, dipping the first torch head into a container of oil, letting the rags soak up the viscous liquid. "They are extensions of our will, the vessels of divine judgment. We anoint them not with holy chrism, but with the fuel of truth." He handed the first dripping torch to Sister Constance. Then he prepared and handed one to Sister Mercy, and another to Sister Ruth. Finally, he prepared the last one and held it out to Sister Abigail. "To you, my most devoted, my bride of the Ember, falls the highest honor and the heaviest burden," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "You will carry the spark. You will bear the holy flame itself." He gave her a tinderbox, its steel and flint cold and heavy in her hand. Then he picked up one of the small oil pots. "And this," he said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "is for the heart of the corruption. For the place where your own weakness once resided. You will anoint the threshold of your former home. You will ensure that the purification begins where your own attachment to this world was the strongest." Sister Abigail took the pot. It was cool to the touch, but she felt its potential heat as a palpable force. This was no longer an abstract concept, a fiery sermon or a blood covenant. This was the physical reality of the task. The torch was heavy in her other hand, the smell of the oil thick in her nostrils. Father Ignatius raised his hands over them. "Go now into the night. Place these tools at the appointed places at the edge of the wood, overlooking the valley. They will be ready for us when the time is right. Let this act be your final prayer of preparation. See the lights of their sin. Smell the decadence of their feast. And harden your hearts. For in 2 nights' time, we shall return not to hide our tools, but to use them. We shall answer their revelry with a roar of holy fire. The harvest of the Lord is at hand, and we are his reapers." Silent as shadows, the 4 nuns slipped out of a little-used postern gate at the back of the convent grounds. Each carried her torch, a promise of destruction. Sister Abigail carried the additional weight of the oil pot and the tinderbox, the instruments of her family's doom. They moved down the wooded slope, their dark habits blending with the night, their faces set like stone. Below them, Mercy Hollow glowed with warm, golden light, a tapestry of music and laughter woven against the black velvet of the night. And above it all, the harvest moon shone down, a benevolent, blind eye upon a scene of pastoral peace, utterly unaware of the 4 dark angels circling its perimeter, laying the groundwork for its annihilation. The 2 days that separated the harvest moon from the appointed night of the new moon were an eternity of compressed dread and feverish anticipation within the stone walls of St. Jude's. For the Sisters of the Ember, the formal routines of the cloister became a meaningless pantomime, a series of hollow gestures they performed with robotic precision while their true selves were focused on the impending cataclysm. The stolen combustibles, now strategically hidden at the forest's edge, called to them like a dark lodestone. The memory of the festive lights and sounds from the valley below, which they had witnessed during their nocturnal errand, was no longer a mocking jeer but a confirmation of the profound corruption they were destined to purge. The new moon arrived, cloaking the world in a profound and absolute blackness. It was a darkness that felt intentional, a divine shroud thrown over the earth to hide the terrible surgery that was about to be performed. There were no stars, no sliver of lunar light, only a pressing velvety void that seemed to swallow sound and substance alike. In the deep cellar, The final gathering was a stark and silent affair. There were no more sermons, no more chants, no more rituals of blood. Father Ignatius's words were few, stripped down to the bare essentials of a military commander giving a final briefing before a battle. "The hour is upon us," he said, his voice a low, cold thing in the darkness, illuminated only by the single shuttered lantern. "The world sleeps, unrepentant and unaware. We are the wakeful. We are the answer to the silence of God. Remember your training. Remember your purpose. Remember the covenant you swore in blood." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze of physical weight. "Sister Constance, you will take the northern approach. The cooper's shed and the blacksmith's are your domain. Ensure the fire takes hold swiftly." Sister Constance nodded, her jaw a hard line, her eyes gleaming with grim determination. "Sister Mercy, the western lane, from the trading post to the chapel. Let no house be spared." Sister Mercy's lips were drawn into a thin, severe line. She clutched her torch as if it were a holy relic. "Sister Ruth, the southern homes, along the creek. Be thorough. Be swift." Sister Ruth, pale and trembling, but with a fanatic's light in her eyes, gave a jerky nod. Then his gaze fell upon Sister Abigail. He did not need to assign her a location. They all knew. "Sister Abigail, the spark is yours. You will light the first flame. You will begin the baptism at the place of your greatest trial. You will lead us in this holy work." He unshuttered the lantern, flooding the small space with a sudden, shocking blaze of light. One by one, they lit their torches from its flame. The oil-soaked rags caught with a soft whoosh, the fire hungry and eager. The torches did not provide a warm, welcoming glow. They cast a hellish, dancing light, painting their gaunt faces in stark relief, transforming them from nuns into furies. The air filled with the sharp smell of burning pitch and hot metal. Without another word, they filed out of the cellar, through the postern gate, and into the consuming darkness. They moved not as a group, but as a scattered line of individual embers, each carrying her own portion of the coming inferno. Their dark habits made them one with the night, their progress marked only by the four bobbing points of malignant orange light. Sister Abigail moved with a preternatural calm, a serenity that was more terrifying than any display of frenzy. The pot of oil was cool in one hand, the burning torch held high in the other, its heat a palpable force against her face. The tinderbox was secure in a pocket of her habit. She did not need to think of her path. Her feet knew the way, carrying her down the familiar slope, past the hidden cache of supplies, and towards the sleeping silhouette of the Miller homestead. The world was utterly silent. The only sounds were the crackle of her own torch and the frantic beating of her own heart, a drum counting down the final seconds of the old world. The house lay before her, dark and peaceful. She could picture them inside. Her father, his large form sprawled in sleep, exhausted from the harvest. Her mother, her face finally relaxed, perhaps dreaming of her garden. Samuel and Ruth, tangled in their blankets, safe and innocent. They were not her family. They were symbols. They were the first and most difficult sacrifice, the proof of her absolute commitment. She reached the porch. The scent of her mother's roses, a fragrance that had once meant love and safety, now smelled only of weakness and sentimentality. She set the torch down, its base wedged between the steps, its flame still reaching for the sky. She uncorked the oil pot. The smell was sharp and chemical, an affront to the natural sense of the night. With a steady hand, she began to pour the oil along the base of the cabin's front wall, a black, glistening line against the weathered logs. She poured it across the threshold, the place where she had once been welcomed with open arms. She poured it over the crushed remains of the rose bush her mother had loved. The task was methodical, unhurried. It was a sacrament. When the pot was empty, she cast it aside. She took up the torch again. She stood for a long moment, looking at the door behind which her past lay sleeping. There was no hesitation, no last-minute flicker of doubt. The vision of the angel, the sermons of Ignatius, the blood covenant, the comet, they had all led to this single, decisive moment. She lowered the torch. The oil caught with a soft, hungry sigh, a sound that was both gentle and utterly final. The black line she had painted erupted into a ribbon of brilliant, terrible blue that quickly deepened into roaring orange and red. The flames licked up the dry wood of the wall, greedily seeking purchase. Sister Abigail watched for a count of 3, ensuring the fire had taken firm hold. She saw the first tendril of smoke curl under the eaves. Then she turned her back. She did not look to see if a face appeared at a window, if a cry was raised. Her work here was done. The first flame was lit. The baptism had begun. Raising her torch high, she turned and began to walk towards the center of the village, a lone, dark figure moving through the burgeoning hell she had created, ready to lead her sisters in the systematic immolation of Mercy Hollow. The silence of the night was now broken by a new, growing sound, the crackle of consuming fire, and from the Miller homestead, the first, faint and terribly distant scream. The first sensation to penetrate Jacob Miller's deep, harvest-weary sleep was not sound, but smell. It was a sharp, acrid odor that was utterly foreign to the familiar nighttime sense of wood smoke, damp earth, and sleeping livestock. It was the smell of burning pitch, a chemical stink that clawed at the back of his throat. Then came the sound, a soft, insistent crackling, like a hearth fire, but louder, closer, coming from outside the bedroom wall. His eyes snapped open. A faint, flickering orange light danced across the low ceiling of the room, a light that was not the steady glow of a lantern or the pale wash of moonlight. It was alive, malevolent. He was out of bed in an instant, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rushed to the window, tearing aside the simple muslin curtain. The sight that met his eyes froze the blood in his veins. The front wall of his cabin was engulfed in a sheet of flame. The fire was already climbing, voracious tendrils licking at the roof's shingles, painting the night in hellish shades of orange and red. And there, standing on the path, her back to the inferno, was a figure. A tall, gaunt figure in a nun's habit, holding a torch aloft like a standard. For a heart-stopping moment, the figure turned her head, and the firelight illuminated her profile. It was his daughter, Abigail. Her face was a mask of serene, terrible purpose. Abigail! The roar was torn from his very soul, a sound of pure, uncomprehending agony. His bellow woke his wife. Abigail Miller sat up, confused. Jacob? What is it? Fire, he shouted, his mind reeling, unable to process the dual horror of the flames and the arsonist. The house is on fire. Get the children. Get them out. He threw on his trousers, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fasten them. He grabbed the heavy wool blanket from the bed and rushed to the bedroom door. As he yanked it open, a wave of blistering heat and thick, black smoke slammed into him, forcing him back. The main room of the cabin was already an oven, the flames having devoured the front wall and now feasting on the furniture, the dried herbs hanging from the beams, the rag rugs on the floor. The air was thick with poisonous fumes, and the roar of the fire was deafening. "The back door!" he screamed to his wife, his voice a raw scrape. "Go out the back." He could hear Abigail Miller's terrified cries, followed by the shrieks of Samuel and Ruth as she roused them. He turned back to the main room, a desperate, futile idea forming in his mind, to try and save something, anything. But the fire was a living wall, advancing with terrifying speed. A burning timber from the ceiling crashed down in front of him, sending a shower of sparks across the room, igniting the kitchen table. The heat seared his skin. Through the roaring inferno and the thick smoke, he saw her again. Just for a second, through the gaping, flame-wreathed hole where his front door had been, he saw his daughter. She was not running. She was not watching in horror. She was standing there, a black silhouette against the blazing night, her torch still held high. And then, calmly, deliberately, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving them to their fate. The sight broke something inside him. It was not just his home that was burning. It was his world, his past, his future, all consumed in that one, betraying image. "Jacob!" his wife screamed from the back room. "The door! It won't budge." He stumbled back through the choking smoke to the small back room where his family was huddled. The children were coughing, their eyes wide with terror. His wife was yanking frantically at the back door's wooden latch, but it was stuck fast, swollen shut from the intense heat, or perhaps, his mind whispered in a final, paranoid leap, barred from the outside. "Stand back!" he roared, and threw his full weight against the heavy oak planks. The wood groaned but held. He slammed against it again and again, his shoulders screaming in protest. Behind him, the fire roared into the bedroom, the heat becoming unbearable. Little Ruth was crying hysterically, her small body racked with coughs. Samuel clung to his mother's legs, sobbing. With a final, desperate heave, born of a strength he did not know he possessed, Jacob Miller threw himself at the door. There was a splintering crack, and the door flew open, revealing the cool, clean night air of the backyard. He shoved his wife and children through the opening, stumbling out after them, gasping and choking. They collapsed on the damp grass, coughing up black phlegm, their lungs burning. They were safe. They had escaped. But as they turned to look, they saw there was no safety to be had. Their home was a roaring pyre, the flames leaping 50 feet into the air, lighting up the entire valley with a ghastly, dawn-like glow. And as they watched, numb with shock and grief, they saw other points of light springing to life across Mercy Hollow. To the north, near the cooper's shop, a new fire blossomed. To the west, another. The faint, terrified sound of a bell began to ring from the chapel, a frantic, clanging alarm that was quickly swallowed by the growing roar of the conflagration and the first, distant screams of their neighbors. Jacob Miller lay on the grass, holding his weeping wife and terrified children, watching the world he had built be devoured. But the image burned into his mind, more searing than any flame, was not of his burning home, but of his daughter's face, calm, resolute, and utterly monstrous, as she lit the match that had destroyed them all. The Miller homestead was the first to fall, a beacon of damnation that signaled the start of the end for everyone. The single, contained blaze at the Miller homestead was a mere spark tossed into a tinder-dry field. Within minutes, it became the epicenter of a cataclysm that erupted across Mercy Hollow with a speed and ferocity that defied nature. The night, once a tranquil canvas of stars and silence, was now a hellscape painted in violent oranges, searing reds, and choking blacks. The frantic, clanging bell from the chapel tower, rung by a terrified sexton who had been awakened by the glow, was a futile gesture. Its desperate peal was not a call to action that could be answered, but a death knell, a soundtrack to the apocalypse. The sound was quickly overwhelmed by a rising cacophony of terror, the roar of the flames, a sound like a monstrous beast devouring the world, the explosive pop and crack of glass shattering and timber snapping in the intense heat, and beneath it all, the human sounds, screams of pure, unadulterated fear, shouts of names, the desperate cries of mothers for children and husbands for wives. Sister Constance, a stocky, relentless fury, had been thorough in her work to the north. The cooper's shed, filled with dry wood and barrels of flammable pitch, went up not like a building, but like a bomb. The blast was audible across the valley, a deep whump that sent a fireball rolling into the sky, scattering burning embers like a demonic sowing of seeds onto the roofs of nearby houses. The blacksmith's forge, with its bellows and coal, became a secondary furnace, its heat so intense it melted the tools within. To the west, Sister Mercy moved with a cold, methodical precision. The trading post, with its stores of lamp oil, flour dust, and dry goods, was a death trap. The fire swept through it with a hungry gasp, the windows blowing out in showers of glittering, molten glass. She then moved down the lane, her torch touching the eaves of each clapboard house. The structures, built of aged, desiccated wood, caught as if made of paper. Families who had stumbled, bleary-eyed and confused, from their beds found their escape routes already cut off by walls of flame. The very air became unbreathable, superheated and thick with toxic smoke. Along the creek to the south, Sister Ruth, her initial tremors replaced by a zealous frenzy, fulfilled her grim duty. The homes here, nestled among the trees, were particularly vulnerable. The fire leaped from roof to roof, jumped the narrow creek as if it were a mere trickle, and set the surrounding forest alight. The ancient, resinous pines became towering torches, their needles exploding with a sound like gunfire, adding a new, terrifying dimension to the inferno. The creek, once a source of life, now steamed and boiled in places, its waters reflecting the nightmare above. And through the heart of this maelstrom walked Sister Abigail. She was no longer just a participant, she was the high priestess of the Holocaust. Having lit the primal flame, she now moved to ensure its dominion was absolute. Her torch was a conductor's baton, directing the symphony of destruction. She saw not the horror but the divine purpose. The screams were not the sounds of dying neighbors, but the death cries of sin. The collapsing buildings were not homes being destroyed, but idols being toppled. She approached the chapel. Its whitewashed walls were now stained orange by the reflected fire. The bell had fallen silent. She could see figures inside, a huddled mass of humanity who had fled there, seeking sanctuary in the house of God. They pressed against the stained glass windows, their faces distorted by fear and the colored glass, like souls already trapped in a medieval depiction of hell. With a calm that was the most terrifying thing of all, Sister Abigail approached the chapel's main door. It was a stout piece of oak, meant to last generations. She poured the last of her reserve oil from a small skin along its base and across the threshold. She then thrust her torch against it. The old, dry wood, anointed with fuel, caught immediately. The flames raced up the door, licking at the cross carved into its center. From within, the huddled survivors saw the flames bloom against the door and the windows, sealing their fate. Their prayers turned to shrieks of utter despair. Sister Abigail stood and watched, her face illuminated by the conflagration she had ordained. This was the final, symbolic act. The destruction of the old faith, the comfortable, forgiving God of her parents. This was the true baptism by fire, and the chapel was its font. There was no escape from Mercy Hollow. The fires formed a nearly continuous ring, a wall of heat so intense it created its own wind, a roaring gale that sucked oxygen from the air and fed the flames further. Those who tried to flee through the fields were cut down by the searing heat or overcome by smoke. The few who made it to the tree line found the forest itself ablaze, a trap of falling, fiery branches. The inferno did not simply burn, it consumed. It erased. It reduced a thriving community of souls, memories, and hopes to a roaring, incandescent core of pure energy. And standing at the periphery, their dark figures silhouetted against the overwhelming light, were the firebrands, the Sisters of the Ember, their torches now extinguished because their work was done. They watched their handiwork with a mixture of awe and triumph, their souls as scorched and barren as the land they were creating. The Valley of Mercy Hollow had become a crucible, and every living thing within it was being refined into ash. As the inferno reached its apocalyptic peak, a strange and terrible silence began to descend upon the dying valley. The individual screams had been largely extinguished, swallowed by the all-consuming roar of the fire or silenced forever by its touch. The collapse of buildings was now a continuous, grinding rumble, the sound of a world being systematically dismantled. The air itself was a physical presence, hot and thick, carrying a blizzard of white-hot embers and a rain of fine, gray ash that fell like snow upon the damned. It was in this hellish twilight, standing on a prominent, rocky outcrop on the ridge that overlooked the entirety of Mercy Hollow, that the figures appeared. They were 5 silhouettes, black cutouts against the raging, orange glow that had once been a village. Father Ignatius stood in the center, his arms raised not in supplication, but in a gesture of grim benediction over the destruction below. To his right and left stood the 4 Sisters of the Ember, their habits flowing around them in the superheated winds rising from the valley, making them look like wraiths dancing at the mouth of hell. Then their voices rose. It was not a scream, not a prayer of panic, but a chant. A low, rhythmic, guttural plainsong in Latin that cut through the elemental noise with an unnerving, supernatural clarity. It was the same chant they had used in their secret cellar rituals, the same monotone stream that had accompanied their self-flagellation and their blood covenant. Ignis divinus, sanctus ignis, purgatoram, purga animus, divine fire, holy fire, purge the earth, purge the souls. The sound was a blasphemy against the very concept of mercy. It was a cold, deliberate counterpoint to the chaos and agony they had unleashed. They were not mourning, they were celebrating. They were not horrified by the spectacle, they were sanctifying it. Their chant was a liturgy for the end of the world, a hymn to annihilation. Below, for the few souls still clinging to life in the scorched earth and smoldering ruins, the sound was a final, soul-crushing horror. Jacob Miller, huddled with his family and a handful of other survivors by the miraculously unscalded banks of the creek, heard it. He looked up, his face a mask of soot and blistering skin, and saw them. He saw his daughter, her face illuminated from below by the fires of her own making, her mouth forming the words of that terrible chant. It was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a wound far deeper than any burn. This was not the work of a madwoman in a fugue state. This was a calculated, ritualistic murder of an entire community, and his child was a willing, chanting participant. The chant continued, unwavering, as the fire began to burn itself out. The fuel was nearly spent. The great bonfires that were homes and barns collapsed in upon themselves, sending up new spirals of sparks. The roaring diminished to a crackling, the sound of a giant beast sated and settling down to sleep. The brilliant, terrifying light faded to a dull, widespread glow, like a bed of coals in a colossal hearth. And still, the figures chanted. Their voices, now the dominant sound in the valley, seemed to soak into the scorched earth, into the very stones of the creek, into the souls of the survivors. It was a sound of absolute, unyielding judgment. It was the sound of a faith that had shed every vestige of compassion and had become a pure, self-justifying engine of destruction. As the first hint of dawn tinged the eastern sky with a pale, sickly light, a dawn that no one in Mercy Hollow had been sure they would live to see, the chant finally ceased. The 5 figures on the ridge stood in silence for a long moment, observing their work. The valley was no longer a place. It was a scar. A vast, smoking plain of blackened timbers and ash, through which the creek now ran, choked with debris, its waters gray and foul. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they turned and melted back into the dark tree line of the ridge, leaving the survivors to the silence and the rising sun. The chant was over. The work was done. But the memory of those voices, those cold, sanctimonious tones praising God amidst the ruins of his children, would never leave those who heard it. It was a poison in the air, a curse upon the land, a sound more haunting and terrible than any scream. The fire had consumed the bodies and the homes, but the chant from the hill had seared the soul of the place, ensuring that Mercy Hollow was dead long after the last ember cooled. The dawn that broke over the Allegheny foothills on that September morning was one of profound and unnatural silence. The sun, a pale, diluted disk, rose into a sky stained a sickly yellow-gray by the vast plume of smoke that hung like a shroud over the valley. Its weak light did not bring clarity, but rather illuminated the full, horrific extent of the desolation in a slow, cruel unveiling. Where Mercy Hollow had once nestled, vibrant and alive, there now lay a wasteland. A vast, smoldering plain of charcoal and ash stretched from the base of the ridge to the far tree line. The geometry of streets and lanes was gone, erased. Here and there, the blackened, skeletal remains of a chimney or a stone foundation stood as lonely tombstones amidst the ruin. Wisps of gray smoke curled from 1,000 different sources, rising like the ghosts of the departed. The air was thick with the smell, a complex, nauseating cocktail of wet ash, charred wood, and a sweet, sickening undertone that no one wished to name. The creek, once clear and chattering, was now a sluggish, foul-smelling stream, its waters black with soot and choked with the detritus of incinerated lives. Half-burnt timbers, blistered pieces of crockery, the twisted metal remains of a cookstove. The trees on the surrounding slopes were scorched skeletons, their leaves vanished, their branches pointing accusingly at the heavens. Jacob Miller stirred from a fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep. He, his wife Abigail, Samuel, Ruth, and a handful of other survivors, perhaps 15 in total, had spent the remainder of the night huddled in a shallow cave by the creek, a place the flames had not been able to reach. They were a pitiful group, their clothes torn and soot-stained, their faces and arms blistered and raw. Their eyes were hollow, vacant, reflecting a trauma too vast to process. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices were rasping whispers, damaged by smoke and despair. Slowly, hesitantly, they emerged from their refuge into the new world. The heat from the still smoldering ground radiated through the soles of their shoes. The utter silence was deafening. There were no birds, no insects, no lowing of cattle, only the faint hiss and pop of cooling embers. They began to move through the ruins, a somber procession of ghosts in a land of the dead. The task was grim and hopeless. They were not searching for survivors. The sheer totality of the destruction made that hope an obscene fantasy. They were looking for confirmation, for something to bury. But the fire had been ferociously efficient. There were no bodies to be found, only grotesque carbonized shapes fused into the earth, a horrifying suggestion of what had once been a person, now rendered anonymous and inseparable from the ash. Abigail Miller walked as if in a trance. She stumbled through the blackened remains of her garden, the rose bushes now mere sticks of carbon. She found the spot where her front porch had been, where her daughter had stood. She sank to her knees, her hands sifting through the warm ash, and a single, dry, racking sob escaped her. There were no tears left. Her grief had been burned out of her, leaving only a hollow, aching shell. Jacob stood over the ruins of his barn, his big hands clenched into impotent fists. He looked towards the ridge, towards the cloister of St. Jude. It stood untouched, its gray stone walls a stark, mocking testament to the source of this evil. The memory of the chanting figures was seared into his mind. This was not an act of God. This was an act of man, of his own flesh and blood. The other survivors moved with a similar, stunned horror. A man named Elias Pike, the cooper, stared at the crater where his workshop had been, the source of the pitch that had likely fueled his own destruction. A woman named Martha Clark wandered through the ashes of the chapel, her lips moving in silent prayer, her faith shattered on the pyre of its own house of worship. The scale of the loss was incomprehensible. Not just lives, though over 100 souls had likely perished, but a way of life. Generations of history, of struggle and triumph, of births and deaths and simple, daily joys, had been reduced to a uniform layer of gray powder. The community of Mercy Hollow was not just damaged, it was excised, erased. As the pale sun climbed higher, it offered no warmth, no comfort. It only illuminated the utter finality of what had occurred. There was nothing to salvage, nothing to rebuild upon. The survivors were not just homeless, they were unmoored from reality itself, cast adrift on a sea of ash, the only sound the memory of a roaring fire and a cold, chanting hymn that had heralded the end of their world. The morning after had come, but it brought no dawn of a new day, only the permanent twilight of a world that had ended in fire and betrayal. The news, as such things do, traveled not with the speed of a galloping horse, but with the slow, creeping dread of a shadow. It was a trapper, following the Willow Creek up from the south, who first saw the stain upon the sky and smelled the acrid tang of a fire too vast to be a clearing burn. He altered his course, his hunter's senses prickling with alarm, and what he found at the head of the valley stole the breath from his lungs and the warmth from his blood. He did not linger. He turned and ran, his feet flying over the familiar trails, carrying the impossible horror to the nearest settlement, a small milling town called Oak Bend. By that afternoon, a party of 24 men, armed with shovels, axes, and a growing sense of disbelief, stood at the mouth of the valley. They were hard men, frontiersmen, and farmers, accustomed to death in its many forms, accidents, disease, the brutal logic of nature. But they were utterly unprepared for the sight that greeted them. The utter, silent desolation was a physical blow. The world ended here. The vibrant green of the Allegheny woods stopped abruptly, replaced by a monochrome landscape of charcoal and ash that stretched as far as they could see. They moved into the ruins like men walking through a nightmare. The heat still rose in shimmering waves from the ground. Their boots sank into the deep ash, kicking up puffs of fine gray powder that coated their trousers and filled their lungs with the ghost of the dead. They called out, their voices small and foolish against the immense silence. No answer came. They found the survivors by the creek. The small group huddled in the cave, and the few others who had emerged from hiding places looked more like scorched phantoms than people. Their eyes were wide, unseeing, their movements slow and robotic. Jacob Miller, his face a mask of blisters and soot, was the only one who could form coherent sentences, and even his words were flat, stripped of all emotion, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else a long time ago. He told them of the fire, of its unnatural speed and ferocity. He told them of the figures on the ridge. And he told them, his voice dropping to a dead whisper, of his daughter, Sister Abigail, lighting the torch that set his own home ablaze. The men from Oak Bend listened in stunned, horrified silence. It was a tale so monstrous, so contrary to all natural order, that their minds recoiled from it. They wanted to believe in a lightning strike, a careless hearth ember, a tragic accident. But the evidence was against them. The fire had erupted in multiple, separate locations simultaneously. And the survivors in their shattered state all whispered the same thing: the chanting from the hill, the dark habits, the deliberate, unhurried movements of the arsonists. The search began in earnest, a grim and grisly task. They used shovels to turn over piles of debris, hoping and yet dreading what they might find. They found nothing that resembled a human form. The heat had been cataclysmic, cremating everything in its path. They found melted puddles of glass that had been windows, twisted lumps of metal that had been tools, and the stark, blackened stones of foundations. But of the 100-odd souls of Mercy Hollow, there was no sign. They had been utterly, completely vaporized, their physical essence mingled with the ash that coated every surface. The men worked in a deepening state of shock. This was not a disaster, it was an extermination. The sheer efficiency of the destruction was terrifying. They avoided looking at the ridge, at the cloister of St. Jude. It stood there, silent and seemingly innocent, but its presence now felt like a malevolent gaze. The story Jacob Miller told was insane, but the evidence on the ground supported no other conclusion. A sickness, a cold and heavy dread, began to settle over the search party. They were not just retrieving the dead, they were walking through the aftermath of a massacre, a blasphemy written in fire and ash. The search for answers had only led them to a deeper, more terrifying mystery. How could faith, the very balm for the soul, have been twisted into such an efficient and merciless instrument of slaughter? The answers, they feared, lay not in the smoldering valley, but in the cold, stone heart of the cloister on the ridge. A grim and purposeful silence had fallen over the men from Oak Bend. The initial shock of the desolation had been replaced by a cold, simmering anger, tinged with a superstitious dread. Jacob Miller's account, once unbelievable, now seemed the only possible explanation for the absolute horror they witnessed. Their gazes, as one, turned from the smoking ruins to the gray-stone cloister perched on the ridge. It was no longer a house of God. It was a fortress of secrets, the likely source of the plague that had scoured the valley below. Led by the town's blacksmith, a massive, pragmatic man named Enoch Jones, the party began the ascent. It was not a charge, but a slow, deliberate advance, their boots scuffing on the rocky path, their tools, axes and shovels, held not as implements of labor, but as potential weapons. The air grew cooler as they climbed, but the scent of smoke clung to them, a funeral shroud they carried upwards. They reached the heavy, iron-banded main gate. It was shut. Enoch pounded on it with a fist the size of a ham, the blows echoing dully in the courtyard within. After a long, tense moment, a small viewing slot scraped open, and a single, terrified eye peered out. It was the same lay sister who had admitted Abigail Miller on her final visit. "Open the gate," Enoch commanded, his voice leaving no room for refusal. "In the name of common decency, open this gate." There was a fumbling of locks and the groan of protesting hinges, and the gate swung inward. The scene that greeted them was one of profound confusion and fear. The main courtyard was filled with nuns, perhaps 24 of them, their faces pale and strained, huddled together like sheep before a storm. They were the non-sect sisters, the ones who had followed the traditional rule of St. Jude. At their head stood Reverend Mother Patience, her usual granite composure fractured, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her crucifix. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" she demanded, though her voice lacked its customary authority. "This is a house of God, a place of peace." "Peace?" Enoch Jones echoed, his voice a low rumble of contempt. He gestured back down the hill, towards the still smoking valley. "There is no peace down there, Mother. There is only ash and death. We are here for answers. We are here for the ones you call Sister Abigail, and for the priest, Ignatius." A ripple of palpable fear went through the group of nuns. Reverend Mother Patience's face tightened. "They are not here." "Where are they?" Enoch took a step forward, and the huddled nuns shrank back. "We do not know." The cry came from one of the older sisters, her voice cracking with hysteria. "They are gone. They locked us in the chapel during the night. We heard chanting, we saw the glow from the windows, but we could do nothing. We prayed for deliverance." Reverend Mother Patience closed her eyes for a moment, a spasm of pain crossing her features. When she opened them, she seemed to have aged a decade. "It is the truth," she said, her voice heavy with a guilt she could not voice. "For weeks, there has been a schism, a darkness. Father Ignatius and a handful of novices, led by Sister Abigail, separated themselves. They held their own services. They practiced extreme devotions. We thought it a passing fervor, a spiritual trial. We were wrong. God forgive us, we were wrong." The admission hung in the air, a damning indictment of her leadership. The men from Oak Bend listened, their anger now mixed with a chilling understanding. The evil had not been some external force. It had been nurtured here, within these very walls, under the nose of its rightful guardian. "Show us," Enoch said, his tone brooking no argument. "Show us where they gathered." Reluctantly, Reverend Mother Patience led them through the cloister. The place felt hollow, dead. They were shown the empty cells of Sister Abigail, Sister Constance, Sister Mercy, and Sister Ruth. They were bare, stripped of any personal effects, as if their inhabitants had never existed. Then, they were led to the vestry antechamber. The air here still held a faint, metallic scent beneath the beeswax. One of the men pointed to dark, rust-colored stains on the floorboards near the wall. No one spoke what they all thought: blood. But it was the door to the deep cellar that drew their attention. It was slightly ajar, and from it emanated a strange, complex odor that made the men exchange grim looks, a mixture of damp stone, smoked meat, and the sharp, chemical reek of lamp oil and pine pitch. Enoch Jones pushed the door fully open. The darkness within was absolute. He took a lantern from one of his men, lit it, and led the way down the narrow, winding stone stairs. The air grew colder, damper, and the strange smell intensified. What the lantern light revealed at the bottom of those stairs would be seared into the memory of every man present, a vision from a madman's dreams. The cellar was not just a storage room, it had been a chapel of horrors. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings, crude, frantic depictions of flames consuming stick-figure people, of a great sword of fire in the sky, of a black altar. In the center of the room stood a large, flat stone, serving as an altar, upon which sat the empty, blood-caked pewter chalice from the sacristy. And along the far wall, neatly stacked, was the evidence that tied this place irrevocably to the destruction below. A dozen empty containers that had held lamp oil, several sticky, half-empty barrels of pitch, and piles of the knotted leather disciplines, some of them also stained with dark, dried blood. The men stood in stunned silence, the lantern light dancing over the blasphemous tableau. Here was the genesis of the inferno. Here, in this cold, stone room, the plan had been laid, the faith perverted, the tools of annihilation consecrated in blood and fanaticism. The cloister of St. Jude had not been a bystander to the tragedy. It had been its womb. And now, its most monstrous children were gone, vanished into the dawn, leaving behind only the chilling artifacts of their terrible belief. The grim silence that had fallen over the men from Oak Bend in the antechamber shattered into a chorus of muttered oaths and horrified exclamations as the lantern light fully illuminated the cellar. This was no mere storage room. It was a sanctum of blasphemy, a physical manifestation of the madness that had consumed Mercy Hollow. The air, thick with the cloying stench of pitch and the faint, coppery tang of old blood, felt heavy and profane, choking their throats and fouling their lungs. Enoch Jones held the lantern high, its beams sweeping across the walls. The charcoal drawings were not the work of a calm hand. They were frantic, savage scrawls, etched with a furious energy. One depicted a faceless, towering figure wielding a sword of jagged flame. Below it, stick-figure humans writhed in a sea of fire, their mouths open in silent screams. Another showed a crude map of the valley, with specific buildings, the Miller homestead, the chapel, the cooper's shed, marked not with crosses, but with raging fireballs. It was a blueprint for annihilation. "Sweet Jesu," one of the men whispered, crossing himself instinctively. "It's a map." They mapped it out. Their attention was then drawn to the center of the room. The large, flat stone, clearly dragged there for the purpose, was stained dark in the center. Upon it sat the communion chalice, but its sacred purpose had been grotesquely inverted. It was not polished and clean. It was crusted with a dark, reddish-brown residue that could only be one thing. A collective shudder ran through the party. The act of sacrilege felt, in that moment, more violently offensive than even the arson. But it was the far wall that confirmed the full, chilling premeditation of the crime. Neatly stacked, almost obsessively ordered, were the physical instruments of the Holocaust. The empty tin containers for lamp oil were piled high. The barrels of pitch, one still weeping a black, viscous tear, stood nearby. And beside them, laid out with a disturbing care, were the knotted leather whips. Some were clean, but several were matted and stiff with the same dark stain that marked the chalice and the stone altar. Enoch Jones walked over to the pile, his boots echoing in the tomb-like space. He picked up one of the disciplines, the hard, cold knots of leather feeling like a serpent in his hand. He dropped it as if it had burned him. "They flogged themselves," he said, his voice a hollow rasp of disbelief. "They whipped their own flesh down here in the dark, and then they went out and did that." He gestured vaguely upwards, towards the world outside, towards the valley of ash. One of the younger men, his face pale, pointed a trembling finger at a small, discarded object near the base of the stone altar. It was a simple, leather-bound journal. Enoch picked it up. The cover was plain, but as he flipped it open, his blood ran cold. The handwriting was a familiar, elegant script he had seen on medicinal orders. It belonged to Dr. Evans from Oak Bend, who had occasionally treated folks in Mercy Hollow. But the words were not his. The pages were filled not with medical notes, but with a frantic, zealous script. It was a transcription of sermons, but they were like no sermons Enoch had ever heard. "The flesh is a prison, the world a corrupt edifice. Only the purifying flame can cleanse the soul." And then, more chillingly, there were lists. Lists of names. The Miller family was at the top, with a single word scrawled next to it: idolatry. Other families were listed with their perceived sins: avarice, next to the traitor's name; sloth, next to another. It was a ledger of judgment, written in the hand of the one who had become the executioner. But the most damning evidence was yet to be found. Tucked into the back of the journal was a single, folded piece of vellum. Unfolding it, Enoch and the men crowding around him saw a carefully drawn diagram. It was a timeline, leading to the symbol of a blacked-out circle. The new moon. Next to the final symbol were the words, written in a different, more forceful hand, likely Father Ignatius's: "The baptism. The sisters of the Ember will be the vessels. The spark is chosen." It was all there. The twisted theology, the self-mortification, the stolen supplies, the specific targeting, the chosen date. This was not a spontaneous act of madness. It was a coldly calculated, religiously justified campaign of mass murder. The cellar was not just a crime scene. It was a shrine to a new and terrible faith, a faith whose central tenet was destruction and whose sacrament was fire. The men stumbled back up the stairs into the weak daylight, their minds reeling, their souls feeling stained by what they had witnessed. They had come searching for the perpetrators, but they had found something far worse: the blueprint of their fanaticism. The empty cloister around them no longer felt just silent. It felt infected, its very stones poisoned by the ideology that had festered within. They had the proof now, irrefutable and horrifying. But the architects of the apocalypse were gone, leaving behind only the chilling artifacts of their belief and the smoking testament to its real-world application. The hunt was no longer just about justice. It was about confronting a virulent new evil that had been born in their midst, an evil that wore the mask of piety and spoke in the language of Scripture. The discovery in the cellar had left the men from Oak Bend not with a sense of resolution, but with a deeper, more profound dread. The physical evidence of such calculated fanaticism was a poison in the mind. They moved through the ruins of Mercy Hollow now with a new purpose, a grim determination to find any trace of the fugitives. The search parties fanned out, scouring the periphery of the scorched earth, beating through the woods on the opposite side of the valley from the cloister, their calls echoing with a desperate hope for some sign of life, or at least, a trail to follow. It was late in the afternoon, with the sun casting long, distorted shadows from the skeletal trees, that a shout went up from the edge of the forest to the south. One of the searchers, a young farmer named Eli, had been investigating a small, natural depression in the land, partially shielded by a granite outcrop. There, curled in a fetal position amidst the ferns and leaf litter, was a figure. At first, they thought it was another victim, perhaps someone who had fled the flames only to succumb to their injuries or the cold night air. But as they approached cautiously, they saw the faint, shallow rise and fall of its chest. It was a child. A boy of no more than 7 or 8 years, his clothes torn and soot-blackened, his face and arms smeared with dirt and ash. He was shivering violently, though the day was mild. Eli called out gently, not wanting to startle him. The boy flinched, curling tighter into himself, but did not look up. As the other men gathered around, forming a silent, somber circle, Eli knelt down. "Son," he said, his voice soft. "It's all right. You're safe now. Can you tell us your name?" There was no response. The boy trembled, his breathing a ragged, shallow pant. One of the men offered a water skin. Eli gently coaxed the boy to take a sip. The water seemed to revive him slightly. His eyes, wide and glassy with shock, flickered up to Eli's face, then darted around at the circle of strange men, before fixing on the desolate landscape beyond. "Samuel," he whispered, the word a dry, cracked sound. "Samuel Miller." A collective, sharp intake of breath went through the group. Jacob Miller's boy. The sole survivor of the family that had been the first target. Eli's heart clenched. "Samuel," he said, keeping his voice incredibly calm. What happened? Can you tell us what you saw?" The boy's story emerged in fits and starts, fragmented by tremors and choked sobs. He spoke of being woken by his father's roar, of the terrifying heat and smoke, of being shoved through the back door into the cold air. He described the world being on fire, the sounds of screaming, the sight of the chapel burning. It was a child's eye view of hell. Then he grew very still, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing something they could not. "I hid," he whispered. After we got out. I was scared. I ran. I found a hole in the ground. An old root cellar behind the Clark's place. The door was partly broken. I crawled inside." He described pulling the broken door shut behind him, plunging himself into a damp, earthy darkness. The cellar was shallow, used for storing turnips and potatoes, and a narrow crack in one of the old, warped planks of the door had given him a slit of a view of the outside world. "I saw them," he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The dark ladies. They had torches. They were walking. Not running. Just walking. And they were setting everything on fire." The men leaned in, their faces grim. This was the eyewitness account they needed. "Did you see their faces, Samuel?" Enoch Jones asked, his voice low and gentle. "Can you tell us who they were?" The boy nodded slowly, a single tear cutting a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "One of them came close. She put her torch to the Clark's woodpile. It was right next to my hiding spot. The light, it lit up her face." He paused, his small body trembling anew with the memory. "It was Abigail," he choked out, the name a sob. "My sister. She looked right at the crack. I think she saw me. But she didn't say anything." Phyllis smiled. A little smile. "And then she turned and walked away to burn something else. The silence that followed was heavier than any stone. The men looked at each other, the horror of Jacob Miller's story now confirmed by the testimony of his own son. It was one thing to hear a grieving father's accusation. It was another entirely to hear it from the lips of a terrified child who had seen his own sister as a demon of fire, who had witnessed her cold, smiling efficiency in the act of murdering their home. Samuel then described the chanting, the figures on the ridge as the fire raged, their voices a cold blanket over the heat and the screams. He had stayed in that root cellar until long after the sounds had died down, until the sun had risen on the silent, smoking world. He had only emerged when he could no longer bear the thirst. They carried Samuel Miller out of the woods, a tiny, broken figure wrapped in a man's coat. He was the lone survivor, not just of his family, but the only soul to have witnessed the full, horrifying mechanics of the massacre from its inception and lived to tell of it. But as they carried him towards the makeshift camp by the creek, the men knew the boy would never truly be free of that root cellar. He would carry the memory of that night, and of his sister's smiling face in the hellish light, for the rest of his days. He was a living relic of the tragedy, his young mind a fragile vessel holding the most terrible truth of all. The makeshift camp by the creek, a sad collection of bedrolls and a single, smoldering fire, fell into a hushed and reverent silence as the men from Oak Bend carried Samuel Miller into its center. The other survivors, their own trauma etched deep upon their faces, looked upon the boy with a mixture of pity and a desperate, aching need. He was a link, the only one who had been close enough to see the faces of the destroyers and yet had been spared. His story was a ghost that needed to be given voice. They made him as comfortable as possible, wrapping him in blankets and giving him sips of broth. Jacob and Abigail Miller, upon seeing their son alive, had fallen upon him with silent, weeping embraces, their joy at his survival a tiny, fragile island in the ocean of their grief. But even in their arms, Samuel remained distant, his eyes focused on some internal horror. It was Enoch Jones, his large presence somehow calming, who gently coaxed the full story from him. The men and the few surviving women gathered around, their faces grim in the flickering firelight, as the boy's thin, reedy voice began to recount his tale once more, this time with more dreadful detail. He spoke of the terror of being awakened, of the smell that was like Pa's forge but everywhere, and the sound of the fire that was like a giant eating the house. He described the frantic escape, the blistering heat on his back, the sight of his home becoming a pillar of flame. Then came the part that made every listener's blood run cold. "I got scared," Samuel whispered, his small hands clutching the blanket tightly. "When we were by the creek and the whole world was on fire, I saw a dark place. A hole. I just ran. I didn't mean to leave you," he said, looking up at his parents with wide, guilty eyes. Jacob Miller placed a trembling hand on his son's head. "You did right, son. You found a safe place." Samuel nodded, swallowing hard. It was the old root cellar behind the Clark's house. The door was broke. I crawled in and pulled it shut. It was dark and smelled like dirt and old potatoes. But there was a crack in the door. I could see out. He described the scene through that narrow slit, a diorama of hell framed by splintered wood. The orange glow that turned night into a garish day. The dark, swirling figures of the nuns, their habits making them look like moving shadows against the fire. "They weren't running," Samuel said, his voice taking on a strange, flat quality, as if he were reciting a terrible lesson. "They walked. Like when Ma goes to pick herbs. Slow. They had torches and they just touched things. The woodpile. The fence. The side of the house. And it would just catch. Whoosh." He fell silent for a moment, his breath hitching. The only sound was the crackle of their own small fire and the distant, eternal hiss of the cooling ruins. Then one of them came real close. Right up to the woodpile next to my cellar. The light from her torch, it got bright. It lit up her face. He looked directly at his mother, his eyes pools of confusion and terror. "It was Abigail. It was my sister." A stifled sob escaped Abigail Miller. She buried her face in her hands. "She didn't look scared," Samuel continued, his words coming faster now, tumbling out as if he needed to be rid of them. "She didn't look mad. She looked like she did when she was reading her prayer book. Real serious. But different. Her face was all sharp. And she had a little smile. Just a little one at the corner of her mouth. He mimicked the expression, a faint, ghastly upturn of his lips that was utterly devoid of joy. It was a look of satisfaction. Of purpose fulfilled. She looked right at the crack in the door. Right at me. I know she saw me. I saw her eyes. They were black. All black in the firelight. And she saw me, and she didn't stop smiling. She just turned around and walked away to burn the Clark's house. The horror of that moment settled over the camp like a physical weight. The image was unbearable. A child, hiding in a hole in the ground, locking eyes with his own sister as she committed mass murder, and seeing not recognition or remorse, but a serene, smiling dedication to her task. It was a betrayal that went beyond violence. It was a spiritual evisceration. Samuel then spoke of the chanting, describing the sound as, like the priests at church, but wrong. Low and mean. He had stayed in that cellar until long after the world had gone quiet, too terrified to move, listening to the pops and cracks of the dying fire, until a thirst greater than his fear finally drove him out into the horrifying dawn. When he finished, there was nothing left to say. The boy's tale was the final, irrefutable proof. It painted a picture not of raving lunatics, but of calm, deliberate, and utterly convinced executioners. The sisters of the Ember, led by his own sister, had not been out of their minds. They had been in the grip of a cold, coherent, and monstrous faith. Samuel Miller, the lone figure found in the woods, was more than a survivor. He was the keeper of a terrible testimony, a living witness to the fact that the greatest horrors are not born of chaos, but of a chilling, smiling, and absolute certainty. A cold, focused fury replaced the initial shock and horror among the men of Oak Bend. The boy's testimony, combined with the evidence from the cellar, had transformed the tragedy from an incomprehensible act of God into a deliberate, human-engineered massacre. The quarry was no longer a mystery. They were 5 named individuals: Father Ignatius, Sister Abigail, Sister Constance, Sister Mercy, and Sister Ruth. They were heretics, arsonists, and mass murderers, and they could not be allowed to vanish into the wilderness. Enoch Jones took charge with the grim efficiency of a military campaign. He divided the able-bodied men into 4 search parties, each led by a seasoned woodsman. Their instructions were clear: find the trail. The fugitives, exhausted and likely burdened by their habits and any supplies they had taken, could not have gone far. The new moon had provided cover for their crime, but it also meant they had traveled in near total darkness. The hunt began at first light the next day. The parties spread out from the cloister like the spokes of a wheel. One group, which included Jacob Miller, his face set in a mask of grim determination, headed north, following the old Iroquois trail that led deeper into the mountains. Another went south, towards the more settled lands, reasoning the fugitives might seek to lose themselves in a crowd. A third scoured the dense woods to the east, and the fourth, led by Enoch himself, tracked west, towards the Ohio River. The northern party found the first sign within a few hours. A shred of coarse, gray serge fabric, snagged on a blackberry bramble. It was from a nun's habit. Further on, they found a clear footprint in a patch of soft earth near a stream, the narrow, unmistakable impression of a woman's heeled shoe, of a type not commonly worn by frontier women. The trail was there, but it was cold. The fugitives had a full night's head start. The western party, pushing through thick undergrowth, made a more chilling discovery. In a small, hidden clearing, they found the remains of a cold campfire. Nearby, tucked under a rock as if deliberately left behind, was a single, knotted leather discipline, identical to the ones found in the cellar. It was a taunt, a relic discarded by someone who believed they were on a divine mission and felt no need to hide their past. Days turned into a week. The search parties covered vast tracts of wilderness, questioning isolated homesteaders, trappers, and any travelers they met. The story of the burning of Mercy Hollow had spread like wildfire itself, carried by a tide of outrage and fear. Descriptions of the 5 fugitives were on every lip. But they had seemingly vanished. Rumors and false leads sprouted like poisonous mushrooms. A preacher matching Ignatius's description was said to be holding fiery revivals in a valley 50 miles to the south. A group of severe-looking women in dark dresses had been seen boarding a flatboat on the Ohio, heading towards the uncharted territories. A hunter claimed to have seen a pale woman with burning eyes, watching him from the tree line deep in the mountains. Each lead was pursued with desperate hope, but each one dissolved into nothing. The preacher was a harmless eccentric. The women on the flatboat were settlers' wives. The pale woman was a trick of the light. The sheer vastness of the American frontier began to dawn on the pursuers. It was a continent that could swallow armies, let alone 5 determined individuals. The wilderness offered a million hiding places, and the fugitives seemed to possess an uncanny ability to move through it without leaving a trace, as if the forest itself were protecting them. As the days stretched on, the initial fury of the hunt began to be tempered by a creeping sense of futility. The men had farms to tend, families to feed. They could not spend the rest of their lives chasing phantoms. The search parties returned to Oak Bend, one by one, their faces etched with exhaustion and defeat. Only Jacob Miller refused to give up. For weeks, then months, he would disappear into the woods for days at a time, a solitary figure armed with a rifle and a bottomless well of grief and rage. He followed every rumor, no matter how faint, driven by a need for justice that was as much a part of him now as his own breath. But he found nothing. No warm campfire, no discarded relic, no glimpse of a gray habit. The sect had disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them. The hunt had failed. The firebrands were gone, leaving behind a legacy of ash, a valley of ghosts, and a silence that was, in its own way, more terrifying than the flames that had created it. The question now was not where they had gone, but what they would do next. With the failure of the manhunt, the raw, bleeding wound of Mercy Hollow's destruction began to slowly scar over, but it was a scar that would forever pull and ache. In the absence of justice, the human mind, seeking order in chaos, began to weave a tapestry of legend around the terrible event. The stark, historical facts, the names, the cellar, the boy's testimony, slowly blurred, merging with superstition, fear, and the dark, romantic allure of the unexplained. In the taprooms of Oak Bend and the surrounding settlements, the story was told and retold, each telling adding a new thread, a new layer of the macabre. The Sisters of the Ember were no longer just 5 fanatical individuals. They became spectral figures, avenging angels or demons depending on the teller's bent. Father Ignatius was transformed into a figure of satanic grandeur, a fallen priest who could command the elements and whose voice could summon hellfire. The most persistent legend concerned their disappearance. The official, pragmatic conclusion was that they had succumbed to the wilderness, starved, fell from a cliff, or were killed by animals or hostile tribes. But the people, in their hearts, knew this was too simple, too clean an ending for such a profound evil. One popular tale held that they had not fled at all, but had achieved a twisted apotheosis. It was said that on the night of the fire, they had walked, unscathed, into the heart of the inferno, offering themselves as the final, perfect sacrifice to their fiery god, and had been consumed, their souls merging with the flames they so loved. On certain still nights, when the wind sighed just so through the scorched valley, some claimed you could still hear their faint, chanting voices echoing from the very ashes. Another, darker rumor whispered that they lived on, that they had found refuge in some hidden valley, perhaps high in the impassable mountains, where they continued their blasphemous rites, a festering cyst of fanaticism waiting to burst forth once more. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of seeing campfires in the deep woods where no one should be, fires that burned with an unnatural, greenish hue. A missing cow or a strangely desiccated animal carcass would be immediately attributed to the wandering nuns. The boy, Samuel Miller, became a central, tragic figure in these legends. He was the child of the ashes, the lone soul spared by the fire-starting sister. Some said he had been marked by God, that he possessed the second sight and could see the ghosts of the dead that now haunted the hollow. Others, more cruelly, whispered that his survival was a curse, that his sister's smile had imprinted a darkness on his soul that would never leave him. He grew into a quiet, withdrawn man, forever shadowed by his past, a living monument to the tragedy. The valley itself became a place of power, but a negative, baleful power. It was shunned. The few farmers whose land bordered it reported their livestock would sometimes refuse to graze near the tree line, growing skittish and agitated for no apparent reason. The game was said to be scarce and strangely flavored. The land, it was said, was poisoned. The very soil was cursed, having drunk too deep of innocent blood and unholy fire. No one attempted to resettle Mercy Hollow. The idea was unthinkable. The blackened foundations were left to be reclaimed by brambles and weeds. The place became a byword for tragedy, a local geographic synonym for damnation. Parents would warn their children, "Behave, or the Sisters of the Ember will come for you in the night." It was a story to enforce morality through terror. And through it all, the question lingered, a ghost at the feast of every telling. What became of them? The lack of a body, a grave, a definitive ending, was a hole in the story that the human imagination was compelled to fill. The legend grew because the truth was too terrible to be left unfinished. The Sisters of the Ember and their mad priest had achieved a form of immortality, not in heaven or hell, but in the fearful, whispering hearts of the living. They were no longer just murderers. They were a folk tale, a cautionary myth, a permanent stain on the landscape of memory. The fire had burned out in a night, but the legend it spawned would smolder for generations. As the years turned into decades, the stark, physical horror of the Mercy Hollow massacre softened, blurred by time and the relentless reclamation of nature. Saplings pierced the ash-choked earth, growing into a young, thin forest that slowly veiled the worst of the scars. Brambles and wild roses, nature's own shroud, crept over the blackened foundation stones and the rusted, skeletal remains of tools. Yet, for all this green progress, the valley was never truly healed. A sickness lingered in its soil, a spiritual miasma that no amount of rain or sunshine could cleanse. The place had become permanently other, a wound on the world that would not close. The official name, Mercy Hollow, fell out of use. On maps, it was simply a blank, unnamed space between two ridges. But among the people of the region, it had a new name, spoken in hushed tones: the Cursed Land. It was a place one did not go, a place where the very air felt different, colder, heavier, as if the memory of the fire had stolen all the warmth forever. The legends, born in the immediate aftermath, did not fade. They crystallized, becoming part of the immutable folklore of the Allegheny foothills. And with these legends came the hauntings. It began with small, unsettling occurrences. A hunter, venturing too close to the old valley in pursuit of a deer, would return white-faced and shaken, speaking of a sudden, inexplicable chill that had descended upon him in the midst of a warm afternoon, a cold so profound it had felt like a plunge into a winter river. His breath would plume in the air, and the leaves around him would frost over, yet 50 yards away, the sun would be shining. He would speak of a feeling of being watched by 1,000 hostile eyes, a palpable pressure that drove him from the place in a blind panic. Others told of sounds, not the natural sounds of the forest, but echoes of that terrible night. A traveler caught on the ridge road at dusk swore he heard, faintly on the wind, the frantic clanging of the chapel bell, a sound that had been silenced forever when the tower collapsed into the inferno. Another, a trapper camping a safe distance away, was woken in the dead of night by what he described as a low, rhythmic chanting, the same Latin phrases the search party had read in the journal, carried on a wind that stirred no leaves. The most common and persistent haunting, however, was the light. On the anniversary of the fire, and on other nights when the moon was dark or the fog lay thick in the valleys, people would report seeing a faint, ghostly glow emanating from the heart of the hollow. It was not the warm, orange glow of a campfire, but a cold, sickly luminescence, a pale greenish-white like foxfire or rotting wood. Some said it was the residual energy of the immense heat, a phantom flame that still flickered in the spiritual realm. Others, their voices dropping to a whisper, claimed it was the Sisters of the Ember themselves, gathered for some spectral reenactment of their terrible ritual, their torches still burning with the cold fire of the angel Abigail had seen in her vision. These stories were fervently believed by the country folk, and even the more skeptical townsfolk in Oak Bend gave the place a wide berth. The road that had once led into Mercy Hollow was now overgrown, deliberately avoided. It was considered bad luck to even speak of the place lightly. To take a souvenir, a piece of twisted metal, a shard of stained glass from the chapel, was to invite the curse into your own home. Misfortune that befell a family, a sick child, a failed crop, a barn fire, would sometimes be attributed, in hushed, fearful conversations, to someone's grandfather having taken a nail from the ruins. The haunting was not merely a collection of ghost stories, it was an active, psychological force that shaped the land and its people. It served as a permanent memorial to the dead, a warning against the dangers of fanaticism, and a reminder that some sins were so great they could poison the very earth upon which they were committed. The physical fire had lasted a single night, but the haunting of the hollow was an eternal flame, burning in the dark recesses of the collective memory, ensuring that Mercy Hollow, and the monsters it had created, would never, ever be forgotten. The valley was quiet now, but it was the silence of a grave that everyone knew was restless. Samuel Miller did not die in the fire, but the boy he had been was consumed as utterly as the homes of Mercy Hollow. He grew into a man, but it was a growth stunted and twisted by the root cellar, by the memory of heat and the image of his sister's smiling face haloed in flame. He was a sapling that had been scorched, forever bearing the blackened scar of that night on his soul. He lived with his parents on the outskirts of Oak Bend, in a small, plain cabin that Jacob built with wood that seemed to him forever tainted by the memory of the grander home he had lost. The family was a trinity of shared trauma, bound together by a grief so profound it had become a fourth, silent member of the household. Jacob's once booming voice was now a low, infrequent rumble. Abigail, who had nurtured beauty with such love, now kept a house devoid of ornament, her hands, which had tended roses, now occupied with the grim, utilitarian tasks of survival. And Samuel was the ghost between them. He was a quiet, watchful child who became a quiet, watchful man. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were practical and few. He avoided the company of others, especially as he grew older and the other young men of Oak Bend began to court, to drink, to make merry. Their laughter felt like a foreign language to him, their boisterousness a shocking disregard for the darkness he knew lay just beneath the surface of the world. He could not understand how they could be so loud when the memory of silence, the terrible chanting silence from the ridge, could still ring so clearly in his ears. His sleep was a battleground. Night after night, he was returned to the root cellar. In his dreams, the crack in the door was not a refuge, but a window into hell. He would see the dark figures moving, but this time, they would all have his sister's face. They would turn, all of them, and smile their faint, terrible smiles directly at him. He would hear the chanting, but now it was his name woven into the Latin phrases. Ignis Divinus, Purga Samuel, Sanctus Ignis. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering, the smell of smoke and pitch clinging to his senses long after he had opened his eyes to the safe, dark quiet of his room. The world of flame had imprinted upon him a permanent, low-grade terror of fire. He was careful around the hearth to the point of obsession, checking and rechecking the fireboard long after the embers had died. The sight of a large bonfire at a community gathering would send him retreating into the shadows, his hands trembling. The annual harvest festival, once a time of joy, was for him an annual reenactment of the last night of his old life, the laughter and the fiddle music a grotesque parody of the sounds that had preceded the inferno. He tried once to court a girl. She was the daughter of the Oak Bend blacksmith, a kind, plain-spoken girl with a gentle heart. She saw the sadness in his eyes and mistook it for a poetic depth. For a few months, he allowed himself a flicker of hope, a sense that a normal life might yet be possible. But one evening, as they sat by her family's hearth, a log shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. For Samuel, it was not a spark. It was the torch. It was Abigail touching flame to the woodpile. He flinched so violently he knocked over his chair, his face a mask of pure, undiluted terror. He fled the house without a word and never returned. The girl, hurt and confused, eventually married another. Samuel buried that flicker of hope and accepted his solitude as his rightful penance for having survived. He carried the burden not just of his own trauma, but of his family's. He was the living reminder to his parents of the daughter they had lost. In his face, they could see the ghost of hers. In his silence, they heard the echo of her final, fanatical words. He saw the way his mother's eyes would sometimes linger on him, filled with a love so tangled with grief it was almost unbearable. He saw the way his father's shoulders would slump, the weight of a failed hunt and a broken family bowing him down year after year. Samuel Miller became a man of the woods, a trapper and a hunter. It was the only life that made sense to him. In the deep, silent forest, he did not have to explain his quietness. The animals did not expect him to laugh. The trees did not judge his haunted eyes. He would often find himself on the ridges overlooking the cursed land, staring down at the young forest that now covered the graves of his neighbors. He never went down into the valley itself. That was a descent he would not make. But he kept his vigil, a solitary sentinel watching over a tomb, the keeper of a story too terrible to tell and a burden too heavy to ever set down. He was the living proof of the horror, a man whose life was a long, slow echo of a single, fiery night, forever trapped between the world of the living and the memory of the dead. The relentless march of generations proved to be the most effective, if most callous, balm for the wound left by Mercy Hollow. The survivors, those who had felt the heat on their skin and carried the ash in their lungs, slowly passed from the world. Jacob Miller was the first, his big heart, burdened for decades, finally giving out one winter. His wife, Abigail, followed him within a year, as if the thread tying her to this world had been solely tethered to him. They were buried in the Oak Bend Cemetery, their headstones simple and unadorned, a world away from the rose garden that had once been her pride. Samuel Miller, now a man in his middle years, lived on in the cabin his father had built. He was a fixture in Oak Bend, a familiar but distant figure, known as the Hollow Man behind his back. The specific, gut-wrenching terror of his story began to soften with the passing of those who had witnessed the aftermath. The tale was inherited by children and grandchildren who had never known the Millers or the Clarks or the Pikes as anything but names in a ghost story. The legend persisted, but its sharp, painful edges were worn smooth by repetition and the human need for a manageable narrative. The complex, theological horror of the Sisters of the Ember, the self-flagellation, the blood covenant, the twisted interpretation of Scripture, was too dense, too psychologically disturbing for a campfire tale. It simplified. The nuns became witch nuns. Father Ignatius became a devil worshipper or a satanic priest. The motive was no longer a warped desire for divine purification. It was plain, storybook evil. The fire was no longer a baptism by fire, it was just a terrible fire. The story was often used as a morality play. See what happens when faith goes too far? The elders would say, shaking their heads. Or, more commonly, it was a simple warning to children, be good, or the witch nuns will get you. The name Mercy Hollow was rarely used. It was now the place of the burning, or simply the cursed valley. Samuel, now in his 60s, found himself a reluctant curator of a museum no one wanted to visit in earnest. Young men, fueled by whiskey and bravado, would sometimes seek him out, their eyes alight with a morbid curiosity he knew all too well. "Is it true, Mr. Miller?" one would ask, leaning across a table in the tavern. "Did you really see your sister set the fire? Did she really smile?" Samuel would fix the questioner with his pale, weary eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen the world end. He would give a single, slow nod. But he would offer no details. The telling of it was a reliving of it, and he had no desire to once again feel the heat, to smell the pitch, to see that smile. His silence was more powerful than any story he could have told. It forced the listener to imagine the horror for themselves, and their imaginations, he knew, could never truly do it justice. He watched as the world changed around him. Oak Bend grew. A new railroad line was proposed, its planned route passing within a few miles of the cursed valley. Engineers and surveyors, men of science and progress, came to town. They heard the local legends and dismissed them as the superstitious ramblings of backward country folk. They spoke of timber and mineral rights, of gradients and efficient routes. To them, The valley was not a haunted grave. It was an untapped resource, a blank space on a map to be filled in. Samuel would listen to their talk in the general store, his face impassive. He knew they would not be deterred. The modern world had no room for ghosts. It was driven by steam and steel and the arrogant belief that everything could be measured, owned, and conquered. The profound, spiritual poison that had seeped into that land was a concept as alien to them as their theodolites were to him. The memory was fading, becoming a quaint local curiosity, a story to tell to outsiders for a shudder and a gasp. The raw, screaming truth of it was known now only to one man, a silent, aging man who walked with a slight stoop, as if still carrying the weight of the little boy who had hidden in a root cellar. And when Samuel Miller was gone, the last living, breathing connection to the reality of that night would be severed. All that would remain would be the legend, a pale and bloodless ghost of the terrible truth, and the silent, brooding valley itself, holding its secrets beneath a blanket of new-grown trees and thorns. The world was moving on, leaving the horror of Mercy Hollow behind as it faded from memory into myth. The relentless procession of years proved a subtle but potent alchemist, transmuting the raw, screaming horror of Mercy Hollow into something softer, more palatable, a tale to be told rather than a wound to be endured. The generation that had felt the heat of the flames and known the taste of ashes on the wind slowly passed into history. With them went the visceral immediacy of the tragedy. The story was inherited by their children and grandchildren, for whom it was not a lived memory but a family legend, a dark heirloom passed down with the china and the silver. Samuel Miller, now a man etched with the lines of 6 decades, became a living monument, but one that fewer and fewer people visited. He remained in the cabin his father had built, a structure that had always felt more like a way station than a home. The world of Oak Bend, once a refuge, grew and changed around him. New houses sprung up, painted in bright, optimistic colors. A schoolhouse was built, and the sounds of children's laughter, which had once felt like a personal affront to Samuel, now became merely the background noise of a town forgetting how to be afraid. The intricate, theological nightmare of the Sisters of the Ember was too complex, too psychologically dense for the new age. The specifics blurred and simplified in the retelling. The self-flagellation in the cellar, the blood covenant, the chilling intellectual framework of their fanaticism, these were the first details to be shed. They were uncomfortable. They suggested a darkness that could fester within the very structures meant to provide light and order. In their place, a simpler, more folkloric version took root. The Sisters of the Ember became the ghost nuns of the Hollow. Father Ignatius was no longer a complex ideologue but a straightforward servant of Satan. The motive for the fire was no longer a twisted desire for divine purification. It was now a pact with the devil for personal power or simply the inherent wickedness of witches. The story was sanded down into a classic tale of good versus evil, where the evil was external, supernatural, and easily identifiable. It became a story for children. "You better mind your parents," mothers would say, "or the ghost nuns will come down from the ridge and snatch you away." It was a story for teenagers daring each other to spend a night in the cursed valley. It was a local color, a quirky piece of history that set Oak Bend apart from other, more ordinary towns. Samuel watched this transformation with a quiet, weary resignation. He was sometimes sought out, a relic himself, by those who wanted to hear the true story. A young newspaperman from Richmond once traveled to interview him, his notepad ready, his eyes hungry for a sensational quote. Samuel had looked at him, this boy who had never known a day of true hunger or fear, and had simply shaken his head. The words were there, lodged in his throat like stones, but to give them voice was to give them away, to let this stranger cheapen them into newsprint. He sent the man away with nothing. He saw the surveyors for the new railroad, men with their transits and their maps, tramping through the woods near the hollow. He heard them laughing in the tavern, dismissing the local superstitions. "Cursed land," one had scoffed. "There's no such thing. Just good timber and a clear path west." They represented a new faith, a faith in progress and reason that had no room for ghosts or the lingering poison of old sins. The memory was not just fading, it was being sanitized. The profound, unsettling truth that ordinary people, steeped in prayer and devotion, could be led to commit acts of unimaginable horror, was being replaced by a comforting fantasy of cartoonish villains and supernatural forces. The real warning of Mercy Hollow was being lost. It was no longer a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute certainty, but a simple ghost story. Samuel would often walk to the high ridge in the evenings, the one opposite the cloister. He would look down into the valley, now a sea of young trees, their green a stark contrast to the blackness he remembered. The foundations were almost completely hidden. Nature was performing the final act of burial. Soon, there would be no physical trace left at all. Only the story would remain, and that story was becoming a lie, a pale, distorted echo of the truth he carried in his soul like a shard of cold, black glass. The world was healing itself by forgetting, and Samuel Miller, the last keeper of the real memory, was becoming a ghost in his own right, haunting the edges of a world that no longer had the capacity to understand his pain. Samuel Miller lived to see the railroad come, its iron tracks laid with brutal efficiency a mere 2 miles from the valley that had once been Mercy Hollow. He heard the shriek of its whistle, a sound that tore through the ancient silence of the hills, and he watched the trains, those great, smoking serpents of progress, carry people and goods to places he could never imagine. The world was rushing forward, and he was a still point, a rock in a river of time. He died in his sleep in the winter of 1889, a quiet end for a man whose life had been defined by a single night of cataclysmic noise. He was found by the neighbor who brought his supplies, a man who knew the story only as a vague local legend. With Samuel's passing, the last living soul who had looked into the smiling, fanatical eyes of Sister Abigail, who had felt the searing heat of the fire she lit, was gone. The final, direct link to the truth was severed. In the decades that followed, the legend of Mercy Hollow settled into its final, stable form. It was a tale told in regional history books, a paragraph or two noting a mysterious and tragic fire in 1802, sometimes attributing it to a religious cult. It was a story shared on porches on summer nights, a guaranteed way to send a pleasant shiver down the spines of listeners. The ghost nuns and the devil priest were now permanent fixtures of local folklore, their historical reality blurred into myth. The cloister of St. Jude, abandoned and decaying, was eventually torn down for its stone. A farmer used the blocks to build a new barn, unaware or unconcerned that the stones had once formed the walls where a terrible doctrine had been born. The valley itself, the cursed land, was largely left alone. Hunters would sometimes bag a deer from its edges, but few ventured into its deep, quiet center. It was a place that felt old and tired and sad. But the land never fully surrendered its secrets. Strange occurrences, while less frequent, were still reported. A survey crew for a proposed logging operation in the 1890s packed up and left abruptly, their foreman muttering about equipment failures and a feeling of being unwelcome, so strong his men refused to work. In 1921, a hiker claimed to have found a small, hidden cave in the ridge, containing a few rusted tin cans and what looked like the rotten remnants of a book, its pages fused together into an unreadable pulp by damp and time. The book crumbled to dust when touched, leaving only the tantalizing, unverifiable suggestion of a hidden history. The fundamental question that had haunted the search parties back in 1802 remained, echoing down through the years. What became of them? The rational, historical answer is that Father Ignatius and the 4 sisters of the Ember most likely perished in the wilderness. They were ill-prepared for a long journey, pursued, and burdened by their own madness. Their bones would have been scattered by animals, their remains absorbed back into the forest from which they had emerged to bring destruction. It is the cleanest, most logical conclusion. But logic has never been able to fully quell the whisper of a darker possibility. The legend, in its many variations, offers other endings. Some say they fled west, carrying their fiery gospel with them, and that similar, unexplained conflagrations in frontier settlements in Ohio or Indiana were their handiwork. Others believe they did not age, that their pact with the dark power they served granted them a terrible immortality, and that they still walk the earth, waiting for the right moment to begin their work anew. The most persistent local belief, the one that feels truest to the character of the story, is that they never left. That they are still there, in the deep woods surrounding the hollow. That on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, if you stand on the right ridge and listen with more than your ears, you can sense them. Not as ghosts, but as a presence. A cold spot in the air. A feeling of being watched by something that is not animal and not human, but something that prays, silently and endlessly, for the world to once again be made pure in a baptism of all-consuming flame. The story of Mercy Hollow endures not because it provides answers, but because it dwells in the fertile, unsettling ground of ambiguity. It is a tale that lives in the space between history and nightmare, between the documented fact of the fire and the terrifying void of the fugitive's fate. We are left with the ashes of a village, the testimony of a long-dead boy, and the chilling artifacts of a faith turned monstrous. We are left with the image of a daughter setting her family home ablaze, not in rage, but with a serene and smiling conviction. And so, the question remains, a whisper on the wind that sighs through the pines where Mercy Hollow once stood. Were they merely 5 lost, fanatical souls who met a deserved and anonymous end in the wilderness? Or did they succeed in their terrible purpose, achieving a form of dark grace, becoming eternal, patient embers waiting in the vast, dark forest of the world, ready for the wind to one day blow them once again into a raging, purifying fire? The records are silent. The valley keeps its secrets. And we are left to wonder and to fear which version of the truth is the more terrifying.